Colton Voss looked at her once, just once, and turned away before she finished climbing down from the wagon. "That's her?" He said it loud enough that she could hear, loud enough that every ranch hand within 30 feet could hear. "That's what my father traded a water deed for?" Evelyn Hartwell stood in the dust of the Voss ranch yard with one boot still on the wagon step and her travel bag clutched against her chest. The wind pulled a strand of dark hair across her face. She didn't push it away. She was looking at the back of his head, the broad, indifferent shoulders already turning toward the barn, and she understood in that single moment exactly what kind of life she had just walked into. Nobody spoke. A few of the hands looked at the ground. One of them, young, sunburned, with a smirk he wasn't quite smart enough to hide, whispered something to the man beside him, and both of them laughed. Evelyn let out a slow breath through her nose. She stepped the rest of the way down from the wagon. If you've ever been dismissed before you opened your mouth, if you've ever stood in a room full of people who had already decided who you were, then you know exactly what she felt in that moment. You know the particular weight of it, the way it settles in your chest like a stone. This is the story of what Evelyn Hartwell did with that stone. Don't go anywhere. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe now and hit the like button so you don't miss the stories we bring you every week. Drop your city and country in the comments right now so I can see just how far this story has already traveled. Stay until the very end, because the ending of this one will stay with you. The morning Evelyn left Harding, Montana, the small farming town where she had spent every one of her 28 years, her mother handed her a cloth sack with 3 jars of preserves inside it and said, "Don't make them regret taking you." Not, "I'm proud of you." Not, "You'll do fine." Not even, "Right when you get there." Just that. Don't make them regret taking you. Evelyn had put the sack in her bag without answering. She had kissed her mother on the cheek, and she had climbed into the wagon that the Voss family had sent for her, and she had watched Harding shrink behind her until the road curved around a stand of pine, and she couldn't see the grain elevator anymore. She had not cried. She wasn't sure if that was strength or just numbness, and she hadn't spent much time deciding which. The arrangement had been her father's doing, or rather, her father's debt. Thomas Hartwell had borrowed against the Northfield twice in 10 years, and the second time the bank had come calling, it was Gerald Voss, Colton's father, who had bought the note before the foreclosure could finish. Gerald was not a cruel man exactly, but he was a practical one, and his son needed a wife in the way that a struggling business needed a new line of credit. Not romantically, not urgently, but structurally. There was land to be managed, and an heir to be produced, and a family name to be carried forward, and those things required a wife the same way a barn required a roof. Evelyn had not been consulted. She had been informed. She was 28 years old and heavy-set, and had never been called beautiful by anyone whose opinion she trusted, and she had known, when her father sat her down at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, that this was the shape her life had taken. Not the shape she had imagined, not the shape she would have chosen, but she had said yes, not because she was obedient or soft or without a spine, though half of Harding had assumed all 3. She had said yes because she had looked at her father's face, at the hollowed-out quality of it, the shame that had cored him like a bad apple, and she had understood that some debts can't be paid in money alone. She had packed her books. She had packed her ledger notebooks. She had packed the 2 good dresses and the work clothes and the heavy boots her uncle had given her when she was 19 and had started helping him run his sheep operation north of town. She had not packed the preserves. Her mother had added those at the last minute, like an afterthought or an apology. The Voss Ranch was 3 hours north of Harding by wagon, past the tree line and into the wide, difficult country where the soil was harder and the wind didn't stop and the winters came early and stayed longer than felt fair. Evelyn had heard about it all her life. Everybody in the county had. The Voss family had been running cattle in that valley for 2 generations, and there had been a time, not so long ago, when the name Voss meant money and permanence and the kind of stubborn Montana success that people pointed to and said, "That's what this land can do if you work it hard enough." But that time had frayed. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it directly. The drought years had taken a toll. The markets had shifted. Gerald Voss had gotten old and sick, and Colton had come back from 4 years in Wyoming to find the empire smaller than he remembered, thinned out by bad seasons and older methods that no longer answered to a changed world. What Evelyn knew about Colton Voss, She had learned from other people's mouths, which meant she had to subtract for exaggeration and add back for malice. He was 34. He was not a patient man. He had a reputation for expecting people to keep up with him and not slowing down when they didn't. He had been engaged once to a woman from a ranching family in Billings, and whatever had ended that arrangement was not a story anyone told out loud. She had not allowed herself to be afraid of him. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford on a wagon going north. What she had allowed herself was something closer to vigilance, an eyes open, hand steady attention to what was actually in front of her, rather than what she had been told to expect. What was in front of her, when the wagon finally rolled through the gateposts of the Voss Ranch, was a property that had once been grand and was now simply large. The main house sat back from the yard on a slight rise, 2 stories of timber and stone with a wraparound porch that needed painting. The barn was solid, recently repaired on one side. She could see the lighter color of the new lumber. The outbuildings were spread out in an arrangement that had probably made sense 20 years ago and now felt slightly haphazard, like a sentence that had been added to over time without anyone going back to edit the beginning. There were men in the yard, 8, maybe 10, doing the slow mid-afternoon work of a large operation, moving between buildings, checking on horses, carrying things from one place to another. They all stopped when the wagon came through, and Colton Voss was standing near the barn door with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a look on his face like a man who had been told something unpleasant and had decided to wait and see how unpleasant it actually was. Then he looked at her. Then he looked away. "That's what my father traded a water deed for." The rope went back over his shoulder, and he walked into the barn and the door shut behind him. Evelyn stood in the dust and the wind and the weight of it, and she did not let herself think about Harding or her mother's preserves or the shape her life had been before this moment. She looked at the ranch house. She looked at the yard. She looked at the one hand who hadn't quite managed to look away in time, the older one with the sun-creased face and the steady eyes, and she held his gaze until he gave her a small, almost invisible nod. She carried her own bag to the house. The housekeeper was a woman named Dora Pratt, who had been cooking and cleaning for the Voss family for 11 years, and who met Evelyn at the front door with the expression of someone who had been told to expect a headache and was determined to be polite about it anyway. "Your room is the second door on the left," Dora said. "Supper is at 6. Mr. Voss takes his coffee black and doesn't like conversation before 8 in the morning." "I'll keep that in mind," Evelyn said. Dora studied her for a moment with the frank, uncomplicated appraisal of a woman who had no patience for pretense. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 28. "I know how old you are. I mean, you look younger than a woman who knows what she's getting into ought to look." She stepped back from the door. "Come in then. I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen mattered. Evelyn had understood that before she arrived, and the kitchen she walked into confirmed it. A large, practical room at the back of the house with 2 windows facing the north pasture and a long table that could seat 12 and a wood stove that was running even on a September afternoon because the elevation made the nights cold enough to require it. There were shelves of dry goods, organized in a system that was Dora's and had been Dora's for 11 years, and a second room off the back where the cold storage was kept, and a door that led out to a kitchen garden that was mostly harvested now, but had the good bones of something tended with real attention. Evelyn looked at all of it. She looked at the account ledger sitting on the side table near the door, left there probably without thinking, the way people leave things they consult so often they stop seeing them. "May I?" she asked, and picked it up before Dora could answer. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were worse than that. They were quietly, steadily wrong in ways that no single bad year could explain. The operating costs had crept up over 4 years while the income line had held flat or dropped in 3 of those 4, and the pattern had the particular shape of a machine running on old decisions, each one made in good faith, none of them quite accounting for the way everything else had shifted around it. "Put that down," said a voice from the doorway. Colton Voss had the particular physical authority of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors doing heavy work, not the cultivated size of someone trying to look large, but the functional density of someone who simply was. He was dusty from the barn and not happy, and the look on his face when he saw the ledger in her hands was the look of a man who had caught someone going through his pockets. Evelyn put the ledger down. "I'm sorry, I should have asked. You should have left it alone." "You're right." She met his eyes. "I'm Evelyn." I know who you are. Then we've covered the introductions. She kept her voice even. Not cold, she couldn't afford cold, but level. The kind of level that communicates, I am not going to perform helplessness for your comfort. I'd like to understand how the household operates. Whatever you need me to learn, I'm ready to learn it. Something moved in his face. Not softness, more like recalibration, the slight adjustment of a man who had built an expectation and was encountering something that didn't quite fit it. Dora runs the house, he said. You can work with her. All right. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he looked at Dora, then back at Evelyn, and something in that look said he had anticipated something, tears maybe, or pleading, or the kind of wounded silence that demands attention. And whatever he had anticipated, it hadn't arrived. He left without another word. His boots were loud on the wooden floor, and then on the porch, and then gone. Dora was watching Evelyn from beside the stove. You didn't flinch, Dora said. Did you expect me to? Dora considered this. Most people do. I've been underestimated my whole life, Evelyn said. She picked up the ledger again because she had been given no instruction not to. I've learned to use it. The first week was an education in how completely she had been set up to fail. It wasn't dramatic about it. Nobody sat her down and announced their intentions. It was more architectural than that. The way certain tasks found their way to her. The way she was assigned to things that required physical endurance or specialized knowledge she hadn't been expected to have. The casual assumption built into every instruction that she would struggle and that her struggling would eventually be the point. Colton gave her the record keeping. She suspected he had given it to her because he considered it a way of keeping her out of the way, the clerical equivalent of a corner to stand in. But she had been keeping books for her uncle's operation since she was 20, and she sat down with the Voss Ranch ledgers on the third day and began reading them the way a doctor reads a chart, looking for the pattern, not just the numbers. What she found was illuminating. The Voss herd was larger than its feed capacity, which meant they were buying supplemental feed at a cost that ate into margins in good years and became catastrophic in bad ones. The grazing rotation was structured around a 30-year-old pasture map that hadn't been updated to account for 2 years of drought damage on the east sections, which meant the cattle were being pushed onto depleted ground while the recovering sections sat unused. The water situation was precarious. The creek that fed the main trough had been supplemented by a pump system whose maintenance record she found in the back of the second ledger, and it had not been properly serviced in 18 months. None of this was a disaster yet. It was a disaster in 3 or 4 years, if nothing changed. She wrote her observations in her own notebook, not in the ranch ledgers, because she had understood clearly enough that any claim to authority she made before she had earned any would be resented and ignored. She wrote them down because she needed to think through what she was seeing, and she thought better with a pen in her hand. On Thursday of the first week, Pete Callahan, the foreman, a man of about 50 with the permanent expression of someone expecting rain, told her she was needed in the east field to help sort the yearlings before the vet came Friday morning. She had never sorted yearlings. She told him this. Well, Pete said without particular interest, you'll learn. She did learn. It took her until noon to understand the rhythm of it, the way the animals moved, the signals the experienced hands used without talking, the particular patience required to work livestock without panicking them. She made mistakes. She got knocked sideways by a calf that was faster than she expected and went down in the mud and got back up before anyone could make it into a story. By 2 o'clock, she could hold her corner of the pen without constant correction. At the end of the day, the older hand with the sun-creased face, his name was Abe Cutler, she had learned, stopped beside her while she was washing her hands at the pump. Not bad for a first time, he said. I fell down. Everybody falls down. He glanced toward the barn where Pete was talking to Colton in the low, rapid shorthand of men who had worked together long enough to stop using full sentences. You got up faster than most. She didn't answer, but she filed it. It was the first piece of information she had been given freely without strategy attached to it, and it told her that not every person on this ranch had already decided who she was. That night she wrote 2 more pages in her notebook. She was beginning to understand that the ranch's problems were not separate from each other. They were the same problem in different clothing, a set of decisions made when the operation was bigger and stronger than it currently was, maintained past the point where they made sense, by men who respected the past more than they respected the present. She understood that problem. She had grown up with a version of it. The question was what to do with what she understood. She hadn't answered that question yet when the first open confrontation arrived. It was the end of the second week, a Friday evening, and several of the hands were gathered on the bench outside the bunkhouse, the way they gathered most evenings when the work was done. Evelyn had been crossing the yard from the kitchen garden with a basket of late squash when she heard her name. Not her name said to her. Her name said about her. "Just seems wrong," one of them was saying. She recognized the voice. Dale Morrow, the young hand with the sunburn and the smirk. Man like Colton, ending up with, look at her. She's not exactly— "Shut up, Dale," said Abe Cutler, flat and without emphasis. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "You're saying what you're thinking, which is a considerably smaller number." Evelyn kept walking. She did not alter her pace. She did not look toward the bunkhouse. She carried her squash to the kitchen and set the basket down on the table and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the north pasture in the fading light. She was not devastated. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, not as a performance of strength, but as an honest accounting. She had heard worse. She had heard it her whole life in subtler registers, which was in some ways harder than the blunt version. At least the blunt version didn't pretend to be something else. What she felt was tired. Not the tired that breaks things down. The other kind. The kind that clarifies. She was here. The ranch was struggling. She could see things in those ledgers that the men running this operation had stopped being able to see because they were too close to it, and because they had stopped looking. She didn't need anyone's permission to understand what she was looking at. She just needed time and a way in. Colton gave her the way in himself, though not intentionally. It was the following Monday that she heard him on the porch with Pete Callahan, going over the projection for the winter feed purchase, and she heard the number Pete quoted, and she stopped walking. The number was wrong, not in a minor way. It was based on the current herd count without accounting for the supplemental feed costs that the east pasture rotation was generating, and it was going to put them short by February if the winter ran long, which in Montana, at this elevation, it had a reliable habit of doing. She stood on the other side of the screen door and held the number in her head and thought about whether this was the moment. It was not the smart moment. She knew that. She had been here 3 weeks, and she had no standing, and Colton would resent the correction, and Pete would resent it more, and the hands who heard about it later would use it as another data point in the story they were already telling about her. None of that changed what the number was. She pushed open the screen door and walked out onto the porch. Both men looked at her with the specific expression of people who had been interrupted in something that had nothing to do with her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. She was looking at Colton. "The feed estimate is short. By my calculation, about 12%, given the supplemental cost from the east rotation. If February runs cold, and the last 4 years suggest it will, you'll be buying at emergency prices." Silence. The particular quality of silence that is mostly made of men deciding how to respond to something they didn't expect. "Where are you getting that?" Colton said. His voice was neutral. Not hostile, not yet, but loaded in the way that neutral voices get loaded when the person speaking is working to keep them that way. "Your ledger, the one in the kitchen." Another silence. "That ledger," Pete said, with the careful tone of a man who was watching to see which direction this went, "is a working document." "I know," Evelyn said. "I've been working with it." She looked at Colton when she said it. She watched something move behind his eyes. And it was not anger, or not only anger. It was something more complicated than that, and she didn't have a name for it yet, but she filed it the same way she had filed Abe Cutler's 2 words at the pump. Not bad for a first time. "I'll check your numbers," Colton said finally. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a thank you. It was the most grudging form of not dismissing someone that she had ever witnessed, and she took it for exactly what it was. A door, barely open, the width of 1 careful inch. She went back inside. She set the table for supper. She had 3 weeks behind her and a long winter ahead, and she was not at the end of anything. She was at the beginning of it, which was harder in some ways, and in other ways the only place she had ever known how to stand. Colton checked her numbers that same evening. She knew because she heard him in the office, the small room off the main hallway that served as the ranch's administrative center, lined with filing cabinets and old maps, and the kind of accumulated paper that a 2-generation operation generates when nobody ever throws anything away. She wasn't listening at the door. She was in the hallway carrying a lamp to the kitchen, and the office door was open 3 inches, and she heard the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't want to be doing. She kept walking. He didn't say anything to her that night. He didn't say anything the next morning either, and she didn't bring it up because she understood, in the way she had always understood these things, through years of being the person in the room whose contributions were received with reluctance, that the worst thing she could do was make him feel like he owed her an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement came on Wednesday, sideways, in the middle of a conversation about something else. Pete Callahan was in the kitchen getting coffee when Evelyn came in from the garden, and he said without turning around, "Colton's adjusting the winter feed order, adding a buffer." "Good," she said, 12%. She didn't say anything to that. She poured herself coffee and looked out the window at the yard where 2 hands were repairing the fence line along the near pasture, and she let the silence be what it was. Pete turned around and looked at her with the expression of a man who had revised his estimate of something and wasn't entirely comfortable with the revision. "Where'd you learn to read a ledger like that?" "My uncle ran sheep north of Harding. I kept his books for 8 years. Sheep. He said the word the way Montana cattlemen always said it. Not quite contempt, but something adjacent to it. "Sheep still have feed costs," Evelyn said. "Pasture rotation, supplemental budgets, winter projections. The math is the same." Pete looked at her a moment longer, then took his coffee and left, and that was the closest thing to a conversation they had managed in 3 weeks. She counted it as progress, which was either optimism or stubbornness, and she had long since stopped trying to tell the difference between those two things in herself. The month of October moved fast, the way it always does in high country when the light is shortening and the work accelerates to outrun the cold. There was no easing into it. The cattle had to be brought down from the summer range before the first heavy snow closed the high passes, and that meant every hand on the property working 12-hour days in weather that couldn't make up its mind between autumn and winter and kept lurching between the two. Evelyn worked alongside them. She had not been asked to. Nobody had handed her a schedule that included riding out to the high range, but she had listened to the conversations at supper, and she had understood that they were short. One of the younger hands had gone home to his family in Billings after his father got sick, and nobody had replaced him yet. And she had her uncle's old stock horse brought up from Harding because she had asked Dora who to ask, and Dora had told her without making it into a negotiation. The morning she rode out with the gather crew, Dale Morrow looked at her horse and then at her and said, "You ride?" "Since I was 9. He didn't have an answer for that, which was the first time she had seen him without one. She filed that too. The gather was brutal in the way that all large-scale cattle work is brutal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just relentlessly physical and demanding in ways that compound over hours. Evelyn was not the fastest rider. She was not the most technically skilled hand on the range. What she was methodical. She didn't make the same mistake twice. She read the terrain the way her uncle had taught her to read it, not as scenery, but as information. And by the second day, she had learned enough about the specific geography of the Voss Upper Range to be genuinely useful in ways that went beyond just adding one more body to the count. On the afternoon of the second day, a section of about 40 head broke from the main gather and headed into a drainage that the other hands didn't know well. Pete started to go after them and stopped. His horse had thrown a shoe that morning, and the drainage was rocky enough that pushing an unshod horse into it was a bad idea. "I know that draw," Evelyn said. She had ridden it that morning on the way up, reading the land the way her uncle had trained her to do. Pete looked at her. The moment stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "Go," he said. She went. It took her an hour and 20 minutes to work the cattle out of the drainage and back toward the main bunch, and she did it alone. And she did it without losing a single animal. When she came back over the ridge with the 40 head moving steadily ahead of her horse, she saw Abe Cutler watching from the tree line, and he tipped his hat at her and she nodded back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. That night at the fire, Dale Morrow sat 2 spaces further from her than usual. She thought that was probably the best result she could have hoped for. Colton had not been on the gather. He had been dealing with something at the main ranch. She didn't know what, and didn't ask. And when the crew came back on day 3, tired and cold and short-tempered the way people get when they have been doing hard work in bad weather, he was standing in the yard watching the cattle move through the gate with the focused attention of a man taking inventory. He looked at the count. He looked at Evelyn, who was at the back of the gather because she had been doing drag and was therefore covered in trail dust in a way that made her nearly unrecognizable. He looked back at the count. 43 head out of the north draw, Pete said from beside him. Your wife went in after them. Colton didn't answer. He watched her ride past without looking at him, because she was watching the cattle and doing her job. And he stood there with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who has been handed information he doesn't know what to do with. That evening he came to the office where she was updating the ledger. She had started doing it daily now, without being asked, because the books needed it, and nobody else was doing it. And he stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. Pete says you handled the north draw. The cattle needed to come out. That drainage floods fast when it rains. You didn't know the terrain. I read it as I went. She kept her eyes on the ledger. Is that a problem? I was quiet long enough that she looked up. He was watching her with an expression that was hard to name. Not quite respect, not yet, but something in the same country as it. The landscape of a man whose assumptions are quietly being revised against his will. Don't take risks you haven't earned yet, he said. I earn what I take, she said. She said it without heat because heat would have made it a fight, and she didn't want a fight. She wanted a conversation, someday. He left. She went back to the ledger. The thing about the ledger was that the more she worked with it, the more clearly she could see the shape of what was wrong. It wasn't one thing. It was never one thing with an operation this size. It was the aggregate of 100 small decisions made by people who were managing for the short term without a complete picture of what the short-term decisions were doing to the long term. The grazing rotation was the most urgent problem. She had already noted it in her private notebook, but she spent 3 evenings in November working through the specific numbers, calculating the carrying capacity of each pasture section, cross-referencing it with the rainfall records from the last 6 years that she found in a filing cabinet drawer nobody had opened recently, building a modified rotation schedule that would allow the depleted east sections to recover over 2 growing seasons while redistributing grazing pressure to the sections that could handle it. It was detailed work. It required knowledge she didn't fully have yet. She was still learning the specific characteristics of the Voss land, and she knew it. But the framework was sound, and the mathematics behind it were solid. And when she was finished, she had 12 pages of notes and a rotational map drawn in pencil on the back of an old ranch record form. She didn't show it to anyone. Not yet. She put it in her notebook and kept watching. What she was watching, partly, was the relationship between the hands and the operation. Specifically, she was watching which of the ranch workers actually understood what they were doing and why, and which of them were executing procedures they had been taught without knowing what the procedures were for. This distinction mattered enormously, because the second kind of worker couldn't adapt when conditions changed, and conditions on a Montana cattle ranch in a drought year changed constantly. Abe Cutler understood. I was the oldest hand on the property, and he had spent 40 years in this kind of country, and he carried a deep practical knowledge of land and livestock that was entirely untheoretical and exactly right. He wasn't much of a talker. She had figured that out quickly. But when he did say something, it was worth listening to. She started finding reasons to work near him, not in an obvious way. She wasn't trying to cultivate him exactly, or not only that. She was genuinely curious about what he knew, in the way she had always been curious about people who had learned things through sustained contact with the real world rather than through instruction. Her uncle had been that kind of man. It was a type she recognized and respected. Abe knew the Voss land the way he knew the back of his own hand. The specific drainage patterns, the places where the soil held moisture longer, the locations where cattle tended to drift when the weather pushed them. He knew which sections had been overgrazed in which years and what the recovery looked like. He knew things that weren't written anywhere because he had never written them down, because nobody had ever asked him to. She started asking him. It took time. I was not a man who opened easily to direct questioning, and she had enough sense not to come at him with a notebook in her hand, asking him to perform his expertise for her. She asked sideways. She asked while they were doing other things. She asked in the specific mode of someone who is genuinely curious rather than someone who is trying to extract information for a purpose. And the distinction registered with him the way it registers with people who have been used as tools often enough to recognize the difference. Sometime in mid-November, while they were checking the fence line on the south pasture in air that was cold enough to see their breath, he said, unprompted, while mending a broken wire. The south section doesn't need the rotation you put in the record book. She stopped. You saw that? Pete keeps the working records on the shelf in the barn. He didn't look up from the wire. I look at what's there. And? And the south section has a spring feed underground. Doesn't show on the maps because it's been 40 years since anyone drew them. Soil stays more active than it looks. You could graze it heavier than you've got it scheduled. Evelyn looked at the ground under her feet, which looked exactly like the ground everywhere else in this part of the pasture. She thought about what it meant that this man had been here for as long as he had, and that none of what he knew was written down anywhere. What else isn't on the maps? She asked. He looked at her then. A direct look, the kind that takes the measure of a person. Lot of things, he said. You got time? She had time. She made time. Over the next 3 weeks, in the margins of everything else she was doing, she walked sections of the Voss Ranch with Abe Cutler while he talked, and she listened and took mental notes that she transferred to her private notebook every evening. It was an education worth more than anything she could have found in a book, and she knew it, and she was grateful for it in a way that she didn't articulate to him because he wasn't the kind of man who needed articulation. What she was building, she was beginning to understand, was a map, not just of the land, but of the operation, how it actually functioned underneath the official version of itself, where the real knowledge lived and where the real vulnerabilities were. In December, the first hard cold hit. It came in fast, the way it does in northern Montana, a 3-day drop from temperatures that had been manageable to temperatures that were not, driven by a wind out of Canada that didn't apologize for itself. The thermometer outside the kitchen door read 12 below on the second morning, and that was before the wind. The cattle in the east pasture were in trouble. Evelyn had flagged this in the rotation schedule she had submitted to Pete 3 weeks earlier. The east section had inadequate windbreak cover for a hard winter, and the cattle that had been moved there were going to be exposed. Pete had looked at her schedule, said he'd think about it, and moved on to something else. He had not moved the cattle. She found out about the situation the hard way. She was up before dawn checking the kitchen water line, which had frozen, and she heard the cattle from the east pasture, and she knew what that particular noise meant. She had heard it on her uncle's operation in the winter of her 23rd year, when they had lost 11 sheep to exposure in 48 hours. She went and got Abe Cutler. She knocked on the bunkhouse door at 5 in the morning, and he answered it in 30 seconds, which told her he had already heard the cattle and had been deciding what to do. East pasture, she said. I know. We need to move them. Pete is asleep. By the time Pete is awake and decides what to do, we'll have lost cattle. She looked at him in the dark and the cold. I'm not asking for your opinion on the procedure. I'm asking if you'll help me. He put on his coat. She woke 2 other hands she trusted. Not Dale, not because she was holding a grudge, but because she needed people who would work fast and not spend time arguing. By 5:30, they had the cattle moving, pushing them toward the protected draw on the southwest section that Abe had showed her 6 weeks ago, where the terrain cut the wind and the ground held enough residual warmth from the underground spring to make the footing safer. It was the hardest 2 hours of physical work she had done since arriving at the Voss Ranch. The cold was a specific kind of painful, the kind that gets into the hands and makes fine motor skills unreliable, so that every buckle and rope and gate latch becomes a negotiation. The cattle didn't want to move in the dark and the cold, and moving cattle that don't want to move is an argument that requires patience and persistence and the willingness to lose the argument temporarily and then try again. They got the herd to the southwest draw as the first gray light was coming up. Evelyn's hands had stopped hurting by then, which was either because they had warmed up or because they had gone numb. And she discovered when she tried to write in her notebook that evening that it had been the second one. Colton found out at breakfast. He came into the kitchen and Pete Callahan was already there, and Pete said, "The east herd's in the southwest draw," with the particular tone of a man reporting something he had not authorized and wasn't sure how to categorize. Colton looked at Pete. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was at the stove making coffee because her hands had thawed enough to manage it and because she needed something to do while she waited for this conversation. "Who gave the order?" Colton said. "I did," Evelyn said. She turned around. "The east section has no windbreak. The temperature dropped to 12 below. I've seen cattle die in those conditions in 48 hours. I moved them to the southwest draw." "You moved them." His voice was flat in a way that was hard to read. Without authorization. There wasn't time for authorization. There is always time. There isn't. She kept her voice even. This was the moment she had known was coming, and she had decided how she was going to handle it, and she was not going to deviate from that decision because of the look on his face. I've seen what happens when cattle get caught in a hard cold without shelter. I wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen here because I was waiting for someone else to notice. The kitchen was very quiet. Pete was looking at his coffee. Dora had found a reason to be in the back room. Colton looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that is actually two looks happening at once. The surface one of a man who has been acted around and the deeper one of a man who is doing arithmetic he doesn't want to do. "How many did we lose?" he said finally. "None," Evelyn said. "We got them all out." Another silence. 12 below, Colton said. Not to her, not to Pete. More to himself or to the room. "The southwest draw has ground warmth from the underground spring," Evelyn said. "Abe showed me. It's not on any of the maps." Colton looked up. "Abe knew about that?" "He's known for 30 years. Nobody ever asked him to write it down." Something shifted in Colton's face at that. Not a dramatic shift. The small, almost invisible kind that means something has landed. He picked up his coffee. "We'll need to reassess the winter pasture assignments," he said. It was directed at Pete. "I've already drawn up a revised rotation," Evelyn said. "It incorporates the underground spring locations Abe identified. I can have it on your desk this morning." Colton looked at her again. This time the look was different. Not softer exactly, but less defended. The look of a man who had built a wall for reasons that made sense at the time and is beginning to suspect that the reasons may not apply to the specific person standing on the other side of it. "Fine," he said. Then he left. Pete sat with his coffee and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "You knew about the spring before last night?" 6 weeks ago. "And you put it in the rotation you gave me?" "In the section notes, yes." Pete was quiet again. He had the look of a man reviewing a sequence of events and not particularly enjoying where they led. "I should have moved those cattle when you submitted the schedule," he said. It was as close to an admission as she was going to get from Pete Callahan, and she understood that. "Weather's unpredictable," she said. "You couldn't have known it would drop that fast." He looked at her like she had surprised him. Maybe she had. Maybe he had expected her to push the advantage, to accept the acknowledgement and extend it into territory, to use the moment to stake a claim. She didn't. She meant what she had said. Weather was unpredictable, and she needed Pete working with her more than she needed Pete acknowledging that she had been right. She was learning the specific patience that this ranch required. Not the passive patience of someone waiting to be given something, but the active patience of someone who is building something methodically, corner by corner, and knows that the foundation has to be solid before you can raise the walls. The revised rotation schedule went to Colton's desk that morning. He didn't comment on it directly, but over the following week she noticed that Pete began implementing it section by section without her having to advocate for each piece. That was its own kind of acknowledgement. She took it. January came in even colder than December had been, and with it came a problem that had nothing to do with weather. A neighboring rancher named Hammond Briggs sent word that he was exercising a historic grazing right on the northwest section of the Voss land, an old agreement, he claimed, that predated both families' ownership of their current parcels. He arrived on a January Tuesday with 12 of his own cattle and the casual confidence of a man who believes his position is unassailable. Colton met him at the gate with Pete in 2 hands, and the conversation was short and not friendly, and Hammond Briggs left with his cattle and a look on his face that said this was not finished. That evening, Colton spread a stack of land records across the dining room table. Old documents, some of them handwritten, going back 40 years, and was going through them with the increasingly frustrated expression of a man looking for something he can't find. Evelyn came in from the kitchen, looked at the documents, and sat down at the other end of the table. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "The original deed covenants. If Briggs has a legitimate grazing right, it'll be written in there somewhere. If it's not, you need to know exactly what is written in there, so that you know precisely what ground you're standing on." He looked at her. "I can read those," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through whatever internal negotiation was required for him to say the next thing, And she waited because she had learned that pushing him when he was in the middle of that negotiation was the fastest way to close a door. "All right," he said. She spent 4 hours that night going through the deed covenants and the original land survey records and the chain of title documents that went back to the Voss family's first acquisition of the property. She was not a lawyer. She didn't understand all of the legal language, and she didn't pretend to, but she could read carefully, and she could track a document's internal logic, and she could identify where something was missing or inconsistent. What she found was that the grazing right Hammond Briggs was claiming was referenced in a covenant from 38 years ago. But the covenant had a sunset provision, a specific, unambiguous clause that terminated the right after 30 years or upon change of ownership of either parcel, whichever came first. The Briggs family had bought their property 16 years ago. The right had not existed for 16 years. She brought the document to Colton at 11 o'clock at night. He was still at the table working through his own portion of the records. She put the covenant in front of him and put her finger on the sunset clause. He read it. He read it again. Then he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands, in the way people do when they have been holding tension for hours and something has just released it. 16 years, he said. He either knows and is testing whether you know, Evelyn said, or he genuinely believes the right still exists and has never looked at this document. Which do you think? She considered it. I think a man who arrives with 12 cattle and that kind of confidence has done some research. I think he looked far enough to confirm the right existed and stopped there. Colton picked up the document. He held it and looked at it for a long moment. You found this in 4 hours, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I read quickly and I looked for inconsistencies. She paused. My uncle had a boundary dispute with a neighbor when I was 24. I spent 3 weeks in the county records office. You learn what to look for. Colton put the document down. He looked at her in the lamplight with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the guarded, appraising look that had been his default since her arrival, and not the flat neutrality he used when he was managing his reactions. This was something more unguarded than either of those things, something that looked almost like a man seeing something clearly for the first time. Evelyn, he said. She waited. He opened his mouth and then closed it again, and whatever he had been about to say, he put it somewhere else instead. I'll send word to Hammond Briggs tomorrow, he said, with a copy of this clause. He'll have an attorney look at it, she said. If the attorney confirms what this says, he'll back down. If he doesn't back down, then we'll have our own attorney. He nodded slowly. Yeah. She stood up from the table. Good night, she said. She was at the doorway when he spoke again. The cattle, he said. In December, the Southwest draw. He paused, and she could hear him choosing words with the careful deliberateness of a man who doesn't say things like this easily. That was the right call. She turned around. He was looking at the document on the table rather than at her. I know, she said. Not to be difficult, not to score a point, just because it was true, and she had stopped apologizing for knowing things. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in her room and looked at the dark window and listened to the wind outside. The serious Montana wind of deep winter, the kind that makes the house groan and reminds you of how much is required just to stay in place. She was not happy, exactly. Happiness felt like the wrong word for what she was. But she was in the middle of something, building something, learning something, becoming someone who was not who she had been when she stepped down off that wagon in September with her travel bag clutched against her chest and a man's dismissal landing on her like a stone. The stone was still there. She hadn't put it down. She had just found out gradually what it was good for. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls of the Voss Ranch house, and the house held, and inside it, in the lamplight of the front office, Colton Voss sat alone at the table with an old document in his hands, and the specific expression of a man who is beginning to understand that what he thought he knew and what is actually true are not, in every respect, the same thing. Hammond Briggs backed down in February. Not gracefully. Men like Hammond Briggs didn't do anything gracefully when they were wrong. They did it quietly, through attorneys and paperwork, and the specific silence of someone who has decided that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping. His lawyer sent a letter acknowledging the sunset clause. The letter used careful language that didn't quite admit error, but the meaning was clear enough. The grazing claim was withdrawn. Colton read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it, set it down, and went back to the ledger she had been working on. That was the whole of the celebration, and neither of them found that strange. What changed after the Briggs matter was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only recognize in retrospect, when you look back at a period of time and understand that something fundamental shifted in the middle of it without anyone calling attention to the moment. Colton began including her in conversations he had previously had with Pete alone. Not all of them. Not the ones that touched on the daily management of the hands, where her presence would have complicated Pete's authority in ways that served nobody. But the planning conversations. The ones about the operation's direction. The first time it happened, she sat down at the table in the office and waited for him to explain why she was there, and he didn't explain. He spread the spring planning documents in front of her the same way he spread them in front of Pete, and he started talking about the calving rotation, and she understood after a moment that the explanation wasn't coming because he had decided it wasn't necessary. She didn't remark on it. She just engaged with the material. Pete noticed. Pete noticed everything that happened in the operational structure of the Voss Ranch, because he had been the one managing that structure for 7 years, and he felt every adjustment to it, the way you feel a change in the air pressure before weather. He didn't say anything to Colton. She was fairly sure of that. What he did was begin talking to her more directly. Not warmly, not yet, but practically. He would bring her questions about the ledger, or about the rotation schedule, or about the feed projections, with the flat efficiency of a man who has decided that someone knows something useful and that the most sensible thing to do is use it. She worked with that. She was careful not to position herself above him, because that would have been both wrong and stupid. Pete Callahan knew things about running a cattle operation that she was still learning, and she knew it, and being honest about what she didn't know was the only way she had ever found to get people to trust her with what she did know. Spring came late to that valley, as it usually did. March was still winter by any reasonable definition, hard ground and gray sky. And the cold that had settled so deeply into the landscape that even a 50-degree afternoon felt like a concession rather than a thaw. But the cattle had come through, the revised rotation, the southwest draw, the feed buffer she had flagged in October. Together, those things had carried the herd through the hardest stretch of winter with losses so low that Pete read the end-of-season count twice to confirm it. 12 head, he told Colton in the office, on an afternoon in late March that was cold enough to see your breath inside the building. Over the whole winter, last year we lost 31. Colton didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "What changed?" Pete looked at the surface of the desk. "Management decisions," he said. The particular inflection of a man giving the most accurate answer he can without being more specific than he has to be. Colton looked at him. "Whose?" "Some mine," Pete said. "Some hers." The hers hung in the air of the office for a moment, and then Colton nodded slowly, and that was all that was said about it. Evelyn heard this account from Abe Cutler, who had been in the barn adjacent to the office window and had not been trying to overhear anything. She didn't know what to do with it exactly, so she wrote it in her notebook and kept going. The trouble that spring came from a direction she hadn't anticipated, which was the direction trouble usually came from. Her name was Margaret Hollis, and she arrived in April with a buggy and a hat that was too fine for the mud, and a way of looking at the Voss Ranch property that Evelyn recognized immediately as the look of someone taking inventory. She was the widow of a ranching family from the eastern part of the county, well-connected, well-regarded, and she had been, as Dora explained to Evelyn in the kitchen with the careful neutrality of a woman delivering information she knows will land hard, a close friend of the Voss family for a long time. "How close?" Evelyn said, not making it a question. Dora looked at her pot. "She and Colton were—" She paused, choosing the word the way you choose a tool. "Close. Some years back." The woman from Billings, Evelyn thought, the engagement nobody talked about. Or maybe not. She didn't ask because asking would have changed the weight of the information in a way she didn't want. What she did instead was go about her work. Margaret Hollis stayed 3 days. She was gracious in the way of women who have been taught that graciousness is a form of power, and she looked at Evelyn with the specific regard of someone who had expected something and found something considerably different, and was not entirely sure what to make of the difference. She was not unkind. She was precise. She asked questions that were shaped like compliments, about the house, about the arrangements, about how Evelyn was managing, and underneath each question was a measurement. On the second day, Evelyn was in the office updating the spring planting projections when Margaret came in and looked at the spread of documents on the desk with genuine surprise that she almost managed to conceal. "You keep the books?" she said. "Among other things," Evelyn said. Margaret looked at the documents more carefully. "These are operational projections." "Yes." "For the whole ranch?" "Yes." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She was recalibrating. Evelyn could see it, the way a person's face changes when they are revising an estimate they had felt comfortable with. "Colton always said he'd never let anyone else touch the books," Margaret said. "It was offered without particular effect, but the content of it was aimed." "People change their minds," Evelyn said pleasantly, and turned back to the projections. Margaret left the next morning, 2 days earlier than planned. She embraced Colton on the porch with the ease of old familiarity and said something in his ear that Evelyn didn't try to hear. Whatever it was, Colton's face didn't change much. He watched the buggy go down the drive and then came inside and poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window and said, without looking at Evelyn, "She said you were impressive." "That's generous of her," Evelyn said. "She doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "Then I'll take it as a compliment." He looked at her then. The look had something in it she hadn't seen before, a question he wasn't asking directly, or maybe a statement he hadn't yet found the form for. "You didn't ask about her," he said. "It wasn't my business." "Most people would have asked." "I'm not most people," she said. She said it without any particular emphasis, the way you say a thing that is simply true. Colton was quiet for a moment longer. Then he finished his coffee and put the cup in the basin and went back out to the yard. And Evelyn looked at the space he had occupied and then went back to the projections. What she was building that spring, in addition to everything operational, was something she didn't have an exact name for. It was not a friendship with Colton. Friendship required a kind of ease that they hadn't arrived at yet, and she wasn't sure they would. But it was something. A working knowledge of each other, maybe. The beginning of a shared language built from months of difficult proximity, from the specific lexicon of a place and its demands. He had started asking her opinion on things. Not always, and not on everything, but with enough regularity that she had stopped finding it surprising. He would bring her a problem, a supplier issue, a boundary question, a decision about equipment, and he would present it the way he presented things to Pete, directly, without preamble, expecting engagement rather than deference. And she would engage with it, and he would take what she said seriously in the way that means actually thinking about it, rather than waiting for the person to finish talking. It was not equal. She understood that. There was still a hierarchy on the Voss ranch, and she was not at the top of it and had no expectation of being there. But she was in the conversation. That was more than she had been when she stepped off that wagon, and she had learned to measure progress in the units that were actually available to her. May brought warmer ground and the beginning of the calving season and a problem with the creek. The water level in the main creek had been dropping since early spring. She had noticed it first in February, a slight decrease in the flow rate at the main trough intake, and had flagged it in the operations log without understanding yet what was causing it. By May it was undeniable. The creek was running at roughly 60% of its normal spring volume, and the cattle in the south and west sections were noticing. Colton noticed it too and was already frustrated about it before she brought it up. "Dry winter," he said. "Snowpack was down." "That explains some of it," she said. "Not all of it. 60% flow with last winter's snowpack doesn't compute. We should check upstream." He looked at her. "That's Fenner Land upstream." Carl Fenner. She had heard the name in enough passing references to have assembled a rough picture. A rancher in his late 50s, neighboring property to the north and east. Not friendly with the Voss family in the specific way of men who have overlapping interests and divergent views of how those interests should be managed. "I know," she said, "but the numbers don't explain themselves." They went upstream. Not together. Colton took Pete and rode north along the creek bank on a Thursday morning, and Evelyn stayed at the ranch because she was needed for the calving rotation. But she had given Colton a sketch of what to look for. Flow restriction signs, recently disturbed ground near the bank, any structure that hadn't been there before. He came back in the late afternoon with a look on his face that was quiet in the particular way of suppressed anger. "There's a diversion," he said. He said it in the kitchen to Evelyn and Pete, with his hat still on. "About a mile and a half upstream, just inside the Fenner property line. New construction. Channels about 30% of the flow into a holding pond on his south pasture. Pete said something short and profane. Is it legal? Evelyn asked. That, Colton said, is the question. She already knew the answer, or the shape of it, because she had started pulling the county water records 3 days earlier on the theory that the creek situation was more than weather. She had the records on the desk in the office, not because she had known about the diversion, but because she had understood that water problems in this part of Montana were rarely purely natural, and she had wanted to understand the legal framework before anything else came to light. The water rights on this creek were allocated in 1887, she told them. The Voss family has a senior appropriation, first in time, first in right. Any diversion upstream that reduces your flow is a priority violation, assuming your appropriation covers the volume you're losing. They both looked at her. I've been reading the county records, she said. I can show you. She showed them. The documents were complex, so water law in Montana was always complex, built up over a century of competing claims and legal interpretations and court decisions that modified previous court decisions. But the core of the Voss position was solid. The senior appropriation predated the Fenner family's acquisition of their property. If the diversion was reducing the Voss water supply below the appropriated volume, Carl Fenner was in violation of priority law. We need an attorney, Pete said. Yes, Evelyn agreed. But before the attorney, you need documentation. Current flow measurements at your intake, measurements at the point of diversion if we can get them, and photographs of the diversion structure. Dated. The legal argument is straightforward. What takes time is the evidence. Colton was watching her in a way that had become familiar to her over the months. The particular focused attention of a man who has stopped filtering what he's hearing through his prior assumptions and is receiving it directly. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since February, she admitted. I didn't want to raise it until I understood whether it was significant. Why didn't you say something then? She looked at him. Because in February I didn't have enough to say. I wanted to understand it before I brought it to you. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not quite apology, which wasn't a thing Colton did naturally, but something in that direction. An acknowledgement that she had been handling this with a care he hadn't given her credit for. All right, he said. We get the documentation first. They spent the next 2 weeks building the record. Evelyn took the flow measurements at the intake every morning, recording date, time, and volume in a dedicated log she had created for the purpose. Pete rode the creek every few days, checking for any changes to the diversion structure. Colton managed the relationship with Carl Fenner, which meant managing the fact that they were gathering evidence against the man while still sharing a county road and a fence line with him, which required a particular kind of controlled civility that Colton managed better than she would have expected. She sent a letter to an attorney in Billings. Not on her own authority, she drafted it and gave it to Colton, and he read it and signed it. The attorney's name was on the back page of an old legal document in the filing cabinet. The Voss family had used her once before, on a boundary matter in the early years of the operation. Her name was Clara Webb, and she wrote back within a week with an assessment that confirmed everything Evelyn had laid out and added 3 points of case law that strengthened the position. The letter to Carl Fenner went out in mid-June. Clara Webb drafted it, formal, precise, legally grounded, with the water rights documentation attached, and a demand that the diversion be removed or modified to restore the Voss appropriation volume within 30 days. Carl Fenner's response was not the response of a man who had made an honest mistake. He sent his own attorney's letter, claiming that the diversion was within his legal rights under a secondary appropriation that he argued had been improperly subordinated in the original 1887 allocation. It was a complex legal argument, and it might or might not hold up in front of a judge. But more importantly, it was the argument of a man who had been planning this for longer than a season. He had not built that diversion impulsively. He had built it knowing there would be a challenge, and he had prepared for the challenge. Evelyn read Fenner's attorney's letter 4 times and made notes in the margins. He's been planning this, she said to Colton that evening. They were both in the office, the letter and the counter document spread between them. The secondary appropriation argument isn't frivolous. It'll need to be litigated. But look at the timing. He built the diversion in late winter, when the low water volume would obscure the impact until spring. He wanted to be established before anyone noticed. Colton's expression was one she had come to recognize as his thinking face, still slightly withdrawn, working through something with the methodical attention he applied to problems he considered serious. He gambled that the volume reduction would be written off as drought, Colton said, and it almost was. You said as much yourself, dry winter, low snowpack. Yeah. He was quiet. Then, how long will the legal process take? Clara thinks 6 months to a year if it goes to court. Possibly a summary judgment sooner if the priority evidence is as clean as she thinks it is. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we document everything, every measurement, every photograph. We build a record that makes the timeline undeniable. She paused. And we don't let the herd suffer because of it. The south sections are going to need supplemental water by July if this doesn't resolve. The southeast tank, Colton said. We could run a pump line from the lower spring. I was going to suggest that. I know you were, he said, and the way he said it, not quite a smile, but something that occupied the same space a smile would have, was the most personal thing he had said to her in the 9 months she had been on this ranch. She looked at the papers on the desk rather than at him, because the moment felt like something that shouldn't be examined too directly. I'll draw up the water delivery plan, she said. Fine, he said, and they went back to work. The summer built toward something, though she didn't know yet what it was building toward. The water dispute moved through its legal stages with the grinding slowness of institutional process, filings and responses, and the exchange of documentation that Clara Webb managed from Billings, with periodic letters that were clear-eyed and unalarming. The pump line from the lower spring went in July, installed by Abe Cutler in 2 hands over 3 days of work in 100-degree heat, and it was not elegant, but it functioned, and the South herd's water situation stabilized. The calving season had been better than any in the last 4 years. The numbers were in the ledger, and they were good, and Evelyn had cross-referenced them against the county average and against the Voss Ranch's own historical data going back 12 years, and the comparison was clear and favorable. She had shown the comparison to Colton without comment, and he had looked at it for a long time and then said, "We need to talk to the regional cooperative." The regional cooperative was a loose association of ranching operations in the county that shared information, negotiated collectively with feed suppliers, and organized occasional equipment exchanges. The Voss Ranch had been a member in Gerald's time, but Colton had let the relationship lapse. She gathered from Pete that it had been a casualty of the years when the ranch was struggling and pride had complicated the ability to be part of a community openly. "What of them?" she asked. "The information you've been compiling," he said. "The pasture analysis, the water data, the calving protocols. Other operations in the county are dealing with the same problems we were dealing with. Same drought conditions, same market pressures." He paused. "You could present it to them." She looked at him. "Me? You're the one who built it." "I built it for this ranch." "That doesn't mean it only applies to this ranch." He said it simply, without apparent awareness that he was offering her something significant. That was, she had come to understand, characteristic of him. He was not a generous man in the theatrical sense, but he had a practical fairness that expressed itself in giving people what they had earned without requiring them to perform gratitude for it. She presented to the regional cooperative in August. She had spent 3 weeks preparing, organizing the data, translating the specific Voss Ranch findings into general principles that would apply to other operations in similar conditions, thinking through how to communicate the technical elements to an audience that ranged from highly experienced ranchers to younger operators who were still building their knowledge base. There were 16 people in the room at the cooperative meeting held in the back room of a feed store in the nearest town. 14 men and 2 women. She knew some of them by name, some by reputation. She knew that most of them had heard she was Colton Voss's wife and had some version of an expectation based on that information. She stood up in front of them and talked for 40 minutes. She covered the pasture rotation methodology, the water management findings, the winter calving protocols, the documentation practice that had been decisive in the Fenner water dispute. She answered questions. She answered some of them in detail that required the questioner to revise their follow-up question. There was a rancher in the back row, older, weathered, with the skeptical face of a man who had heard many presentations and forgotten most of them, who stopped her halfway through the water section and said, "Where'd you learn water law?" "County Records Office," she said. And a good attorney. You read that stuff yourself? The appropriation documents? I did. He looked at her for a moment. Huh, he said, and sat back, and didn't interrupt again. Colton had come. He sat in the second row, and he didn't say much, and he didn't need to. And when she looked at him once, not for reassurance, just in the general sweep of the room, his expression was the one she had begun to recognize as his version of quiet satisfaction. Not pride, exactly. Something more guarded than pride. An acknowledgement, private and unspoken, that what was happening in this room was something he had been part of building. She drove home with him in the wagon, in the late afternoon light, and they didn't talk much, but the silence was a different quality of silence than what she had lived with for the first months of the marriage. There was no hostility in it. There was no distance. There was just two people tired from a full day, sitting close enough in the wagon seat that their arms occasionally touched, neither of them moving away. She filed that too. The fire came in September. It came out of the northwest, which was the direction fire came from in that country, pushed by a wind that had been building for 2 days before the smoke was visible, fed by a summer of dry grass and drought-cured brush that burned away old paper burns, fast and complete. By the time the smoke column was visible from the Voss ranch yard, it was already substantial. Colton read it in the same moment she did. They were both in the yard. She had been crossing from the barn to the house. He had been coming out of the bunkhouse with Pete, and they both stopped and looked northwest at the same time. How far? She said. Not a question. 8 miles, maybe less. He was already calculating. She could see it. Wind's pushing east-southeast. If it doesn't shift, it'll come through the northwest pasture first, Pete said, then the upper sections. Cattle in the northwest? Evelyn asked. 60 head, Pete said, and the main herds in the upper sections. Colton turned to Pete. Get every man. We need to move the northwest herd down to the south sections and start fire breaks on the ridge line. He was already walking, and Pete was already moving, and the yard was transforming in the way a yard transforms when urgency takes it over. Faster, louder, with the particular compressed quality of people responding to something that cannot be argued with. I'm coming, Evelyn said. Colton stopped. He turned around and looked at her, and for one moment, just one, she saw him consider telling her to stay. She saw the calculation pass across his face, the old instinct toward protection, or control, or whatever combination of those things it had been in September of the previous year when she was still just the woman who had been sent north on a wagon. Then he looked at her, and she looked back, and he made the calculation differently. Northwest perimeter, he said. You know the land. She did know the land. She had spent a year learning it, section by section, pasture by pasture, with Abe Cutler and without him, in cold and heat and mud and early mornings when the light was still gray. She knew where the drainage ran and where the ground was rocky, and where the grass was thickest, and where the natural fire breaks already existed, and where they didn't. She took 2 horses and 3 hands and went north. The smoke reached them before the fire did, the way it always does. A lateral presence, thickening the air and changing the light to something brownish and strange. The cattle in the northwest pasture could smell it before they could see it, and they were already moving south on their own, which helped. But 60 head of frightened cattle moving without guidance through a landscape where the wind was pushing fast in one direction was not the same as 60 head of cattle being moved with guidance through a landscape you knew. She knew where the natural funnel was. A gap between 2 rocky outcroppings at the south end of the northwest pasture that the cattle would move through if pushed correctly. Abe had shown it to her in October of her first year. She pushed them toward it, working the wings with the 2 hands who knew what they were doing and keeping the third, a newer hire named Roy, who was willing but inexperienced, behind her where she could direct him. They got the northwest herd through the funnel and into the south sections inside of an hour. One hand took a fall when his horse spooked at a burning piece of debris that came down ahead of the fire line, but he got up and got back on, and nobody was lost. Then the wind shifted. It shifted southeast, then south, and the fire followed it, the way fire follows wind, without negotiation, without warning. What had been moving east toward the upper sections turned and came south instead, toward the ranch headquarters, toward the main herd in the lower pastures, toward the ranch house on its slight rise above the yard. She was at the south fence line when she understood what the shift meant. She was looking north at the smoke column and feeling the wind change on her face and doing the specific arithmetic of fire direction and wind speed and terrain, and the answer she arrived at was not the answer she wanted. "We need to go back," she said to the hand beside her. It was Roy, 17 years old and scared, though he was managing the scared well enough. "Mr. Voss is in the upper section, which is no longer where the fire is going." She was already calculating the approach. The main herd in the lower pastures was between the new fire line and the headquarters. If the herd panicked and ran in the wrong direction, they'd lose both the cattle and potentially the structures. "We need to get to the lower pasture ahead of the fire. That puts us between—" "I know where it puts us." She looked at him. "You can go to the headquarters. Wait there. I won't blame you." Roy looked at the smoke. He was 17, and he had $200 in wages saved, and he had not signed up for anything like what was currently happening. His face went through several things in quick succession. "I'll go with you," he said. She went. The lower pasture was chaos by the time they got there. The main herd was already moving, pushed by the heat and smoke, and they were moving northeast, which was directly toward the worst of the fire path. She and Roy and the one remaining hand came in from the west and started pushing them south, hard, faster than was ideal, without the patience she would normally have brought to moving a spooked herd, because patience was not available in this particular situation. It was the most physically demanding work of her life. The smoke was serious now, the kind that gets into your lungs and makes coherent thought harder, and the cattle were responding to the fire with the collective electrical panic of large animals in danger, which is different from individual panic in the way that a crowd is different from a person. She worked the edges. She kept moving. She fell twice. Once when her horse stumbled, once when a steer cut sharply across her path and caught her shoulder. She got up both times. They got the main herd south into the protected draw on the southwest section where the underground spring kept the ground damp and the grass less combustible. The draw held. The fire reached the edge of it and moved around it the way fire moves around things it can't consume as easily. And then she couldn't get out. The fire had closed the route back to the headquarters from the south side of the draw, moving faster in the dry brush than she had calculated. Roy, on the other hand, had made it through just before the closure. She had held the herd's tail end to make sure they were clear, and she had held it a few seconds too long. And when she looked up, the smoke and fire were between her and the way back. She was not panicked. She was afraid, which is a different thing, and she was afraid in a focused way that made her think more clearly rather than less. She looked at the terrain around her, at the draw, at the creek bed that ran through the lowest part of it, at the rocky outcropping at the south end. And she found the place where the ground was wettest, closest to the spring source, and she moved the remaining cattle there, and she tied her horse to a root structure at the base of the outcropping, and she lay flat against the ground in the damp grass, and she waited. The fire went over the ridge above the draw in a sound she would never be able to adequately describe. Not a roar exactly, but something that combined heat and noise and the smell of burning into a single overwhelming sensation that was almost more than sensory. The temperature inside the draw climbed, and her horse screamed once, and she held the lead rope with both hands and pressed her face into the ground and breathed through her bandana and thought about nothing in particular, which was the only thing available to think about. It passed. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it passed. When she lifted her head, the world above the draw's rim was black and smoking and strange, but the draw itself had held. The cattle were alive. Her horse was alive. Badly frightened, but uninjured. She was alive, though her lungs felt like she had been breathing sand, and her hands were raw from the rope, and she didn't know what her face looked like, but it felt like it had been too close to a very hot stove. She sat up slowly. She looked at the smoke above her. She looked at the cattle, who were beginning to calm now that the immediate heat was gone. Colton came over the south rim of the draw 40 minutes later. He had come down from the upper sections when the wind shifted and had understood what the shift meant and had ridden hard to find her. So she learned this later from Roy, who described the expression on Colton's face when he couldn't find her at the headquarters as something Roy would rather not see again. He came over the rim on horseback and pulled up when he saw her, sitting against the base of the outcropping with her back to the rock and her legs stretched out in front of her. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the draw. He looked at her. He dismounted. He walked across the draw, and he crouched down in front of her, and he looked at her face with an expression that was nothing like any expression she had seen on him before. It was stripped of all the layers he usually kept in place. No calculation, no management, no controlled neutrality. Just a man looking at something he had been afraid of losing and finding it still there. "You're burned," he said. His voice was rough from smoke or something else. "Superficially," she said. "I was close to the damp ground." He looked at her hands, at the rope burns across her palms. He took both her hands in his and held them without saying anything, and she let him, because it seemed necessary, and because she was too tired to establish distance she no longer felt. "The herd?" she asked. "Most of them." His thumbs moved slightly across the back of her hands. "Roy says you moved the main herd south by yourself. Roy and the other hand were there. Roy says you held the tail end to make sure they got through, and that's why you were cut off." She didn't answer that. "Evelyn." He said her name the way people say a name when they don't have the words for what they actually mean, but they need to say something that will hold the place of it. "I'm all right," she said. "The ranch is all right." She looked up at him, at the smoke-darkened sky behind his head, at his face in the strange light that a burned landscape gives off in the hours after fire. "We need to assess the damage before dark." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood up, and he helped her stand up, and he kept his hand on her arm longer than was necessary for balance, and she didn't move away from it. They walked out of the draw together, into the black and smoking land that had been the Upper Voss Ranch, and they began the work of understanding what remained. The damage assessment took 3 days. Evelyn did most of it on foot, walking the burned sections with a notebook and a measuring tape, and the kind of methodical attention that is the only useful response to a large loss. Her face healed faster than expected. The burns were superficial, as she had told Colton, though the skin around her jaw and left cheek stayed tight and tender for 2 weeks in a way that reminded her, every time she turned her head, of the 40 minutes she had spent pressed against the ground in the southwest draw. She didn't talk about those 40 minutes. There didn't seem to be a useful way to talk about them, and she was not a woman who processed things out loud. She wrote some of it in her notebook late at night. Not the fear exactly, but the specific texture of the experience. The quality of the silence after the fire passed. The way the cattle had settled when the heat dropped. She wrote it because writing it helped her put it somewhere, and she needed it somewhere other than the front of her mind, where it kept surfacing at inconvenient moments. The numbers, when she had them, were serious but not catastrophic. The fire had burned approximately 400 acres of the upper and northwest sections. Grazing land mostly, with some timber on the upper ridge that was a loss in terms of windbreak value more than anything else. They had lost 11 head of cattle outright, mostly older animals that had been too slow in the initial movement. 3 fence lines were completely destroyed. The Northwest Pasture's water infrastructure, a pump and trough system that was newer, installed 2 summers ago, had survived because it was metal and had been in a low spot. The fire moved around. 11 head. She had written that number and looked at it for a long time. Against the main herd, it was a manageable loss. Against what it could have been, without the movement to the southwest draw, it was a different kind of number entirely. She didn't put that second calculation in the official record. It would have seemed like she was making an argument for herself, and she didn't need to make arguments anymore, or was learning not to. Colton walked the burned sections with her on the second day. They went mostly in silence, which was their most functional mode when there was something real to look at, and she showed him what she had documented and explained her assessment of the recovery timeline. Burned grazing land in this part of Montana came back. The grass was adapted to fire, had been for thousands of years, and the ash would feed the soil in ways that would show up in 2 or 3 growing seasons. The immediate problem was not the land. The immediate problem was carrying capacity while the land recovered. "We're looking at 18 months minimum before the northwest sections can support full rotation," she said. They were standing at the edge of the burn line where the black ground met the unburned grass in the specific sharp border that fire always makes. Possibly 24 on the upper ridge sections where the soil is thinner. "We can't carry the full herd on the remaining sections for 2 years, Colton said. "No. We'll need to thin by about 20% for the first winter, sell or graze out on shared pasture." She paused. "The cooperative has a grazing exchange program. I looked into it when I was preparing the August presentation. 3 operations in the county have offered surplus pasture capacity in exchange for cooperative participation in their equipment rotation." He looked at her. "You looked into it." "I thought we might need it someday." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same register, something short and genuine that she hadn't heard from him before. "Of course you did," he said. They walked back toward the ranch house in the late September light, and the burned land stretched behind them and the intact sections lay ahead, and somewhere in the middle of that landscape Colton said, without particular preamble, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I came over that ridge and you weren't at the headquarters, when Roy said he didn't know where you were," he stopped. He was not a man who found these sentences easy, and she had learned not to fill his silences for him. "I've made decisions about you since the day you arrived that weren't fair. I need you to know I understand that." The land was very quiet around them. Wind in the unburned grass, and a hawk somewhere high up, and the distant sound of the hands working the fence line on the south section. "I know you understand it," she said. "You've been showing me that for months." "Showing isn't the same as saying. Sometimes it's more reliable," she said. She looked at him. "I didn't come here to be treated fairly, Colton. I came here because my family needed me to, and because I looked at what I had and decided I could work with it. I've been working with it. That's not—" He stopped again, started differently. "You shouldn't have had to earn what you earned. You should have had it from the beginning." She thought about that, about her mother's words the morning she left Harding, "Don't make them regret taking you," and about the particular quality of a life spent making the case for your own adequacy to people who had already decided against it. "That's probably true," she said, "but I'm not sure I'd be the same person if I had." She said it without self-pity, which was the only way it was worth saying. "I know this land now. I know this operation. I know every section of ground that burned and why it burned and what it needs to come back. I know that because I earned it, not because someone handed it to me." Colton was quiet for a long moment. They had reached the yard and the familiar sounds of the working ranch surrounded them. Horses, the creak of the barn door, Dora's voice somewhere inside the house directing Roy, who had stayed on after the fire with the particular loyalty of someone who has been through something serious with people and finds it changes his relationship to them. "I want to change the operational structure," Colton said. He said it the way he said important things, directly, without softening the approach, expecting the person he was talking to receive it directly. "I want you to have formal authority over the land management decisions. Pasture rotation, water allocation, grazing schedules. Those go through you." She looked at him. Pete will still run the hands. That's his domain, and I'm not touching it. But the land decisions, the strategy behind what we do with the property, I want that to be yours." She took a breath. She thought about the first day, the ledger on the kitchen table, the way he had told her to put it down. She thought about 12 below and the southwest draw and 40 minutes on the ground with her face in the damp grass and 60 head of cattle pressing against the rock behind her. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, and they went inside. The conversation with Pete happened the next morning. Colton led it, which was appropriate, and Evelyn sat at the table and listened rather than speaking, because the framing of this mattered, and Colton knew Pete in ways she was still learning. Pete listened with the expression of a man receiving information he had been expecting for some time and had made his peace with, which told her something about Pete she hadn't fully known. That under the flat practicality of his manner, he had been watching the same things she had been doing and drawing his own conclusions. When Colton finished, Pete looked at the table for a moment and then looked at Evelyn and said, "I'll need the rotation schedule updated before the cooperative grazing arrangement starts." "I'll have it to you by Friday," she said. "Thursday would be better." "Thursday," she agreed. Pete nodded once and pushed back from the table and went to work, and that was the renegotiation of the operational structure of the Voss Ranch, which looked from the outside like a very undramatic conversation and was, from the inside, something considerably more significant. The cooperative grazing arrangement went through in October. She negotiated it herself, driving to 2 of the 3 partner ranches and talking through the terms with their owners in the specific practical register of people who are dealing with a real problem and need a real solution. Both operations were run by men 15 or 20 years older than she was, and both of them had been at the August cooperative meeting, and the way they dealt with her in October was not the way they would have dealt with her in July, which was something she noticed without dwelling on. The third operation was run by a woman named Ruth Baird, who was 62 and had been running her family's cattle operation alone since her husband died 8 years ago, and who met Evelyn at the door of her ranch house with the specific appraising directness of a woman who has spent enough time being the only one in the room to develop very efficient people reading. "You're the one who presented at the cooperative," Ruth said. "Yes. I've been ranching this country for 30 years, and I hadn't thought of half of what you laid out." She said it without particular warmth, but without any of the qualified compliment quality that the men's responses had carried. She said it as a fact. "Come in." They talked for 3 hours. The grazing arrangement was settled in 40 minutes. The rest of the time was Ruth asking questions about the water documentation process and the pasture rotation methodology and the winter calving protocols, and Evelyn answering them as completely as she could, and Ruth listening with the focused quality of someone who is genuinely learning something and not performing the appearance of learning. When Evelyn left, Ruth walked her to the wagon and said, "There's a regional planning meeting in March. Agricultural operations, water management, county-level coordination. I go every year and nobody pays much attention to what I say." She looked at Evelyn with those direct eyes. "Come with me." "All right," Evelyn said. She had been saying that a lot lately. She was finding it the most accurate response to most things. She drove home through the October dusk with Ruth Baird's handshake still in her palm. Firm, brief, the handshake of a woman who meant it. And she thought about what it meant to find a person who saw you clearly and wasn't threatened by what they saw. She had found a few of those people in her life. Her uncle, Abe Cutler, in his wordless way. And now, in the unexpected country of her 31st year, Ruth Baird. She told Colton about the March meeting that evening. He was in the office, working through the fall accounts with the improved efficiency that the restructured record-keeping had made possible, and he looked up when she told him and said, "Good." "She's formidable," Evelyn said. "Ruth Baird. I know her reputation." He paused. "She doesn't partner with people she doesn't respect." "I know." He looked at her across the office. The lamp was between them, and the room was warm, and outside the window the first cold of October was moving in with the specific quality of cold that says, this time, it means it. "How are your hands?" he asked. She looked at her palms, which had healed mostly, but still showed the rope burn marks in a pattern that would probably take another year to fully fade. "Fine," she said. "You never complained," he said. It was an observation, not a compliment, but it had the quality of something he had been sitting with. Complaining didn't seem like it would help. Most people would have. "I'm not most people," he finished, the almost smile again. "Yeah, I know." She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, at the specific geography of his face, which she had been studying for a year now, and still found more complex than she had initially expected. He was not an easy man. He had not become an easy man over the course of this year. But easy had never been what she needed. She had grown up with easy men, and she knew what they cost in other ways. "Colton," she said. He waited in the way she had learned he waited, fully, without impatience, with the entire weight of his attention. "This is working," she said. She meant the ranch. She meant the operational partnership. She left the door open to mean other things because she was not yet ready to walk through it herself, and she thought he might not be either, and there was time. For the first time since the wagon pulled through the Voss Ranch gate, she believed there was time. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression settled into something she could only describe as relief. The specific kind of relief that comes not from a problem being solved, but from a thing being named. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The Fenner water case resolved in November, faster than Clara Webb had predicted. The summary judgment came down on the side of the Voss appropriation with a clarity that Clara said, in her letter, was a direct result of the quality and consistency of the flow documentation. Carl Fenner was ordered to remove the diversion or modify it to restore the Voss water volume, and he was assessed partial legal costs for the clearly documented priority violation. He had the diversion modified within 3 weeks. Evelyn walked the creek bank with Pete the morning after and watched the water return to its normal volume at the intake and felt something she had to think carefully about before she could name it. Not triumph. Triumph required an adversary you had conquered, and she had never thought of Carl Fenner that way. More like the satisfaction of a proof that completes itself. The work had been the water measurements, the county records, the documented timeline. The legal argument had rested entirely on a foundation she had built, column by column, over 6 months. A judge in a courtroom in Billings had looked at that foundation and found it solid. That was the satisfaction. not winning. Building something that held weight. Pete watched the intake flow alongside her and said, "We should send a copy of the documentation process to the cooperative. Other operations should know this procedure." She looked at him. "That's a good idea." He shrugged, which for Pete Callahan was essentially an embrace. "You thought of it first," he said. "I'm just saying it out loud." She drafted the documentation guide over the following 2 weeks. A practical step-by-step account of the water rights process, from initial observation through legal resolution, written in the plain language of someone who is trying to be useful rather than impressive. She sent it to Clara Webb first, who added 3 pages of legal annotation and sent it back with a note that said she intended to share it with other rural water rights clients. Then Evelyn sent it to the cooperative. The response was more than she had expected. Letters came back from 4 other operations in the county. And then, through the cooperative network, from operations further afield, asking questions, requesting the specific forms she had used, asking whether she would be willing to consult. She answered all of them. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with her notebook and her pen, and she answered every letter completely, because every one of them represented a real person on a real piece of land dealing with a real problem, and she knew what it meant to have someone take your problem seriously. Colton watched this with the specific expression of a man who is watching something he had no hand in starting. One evening in December, he sat across from her at the kitchen table while she was working through the latest batch of correspondence and said, without quite looking at what he was looking at, "You could charge for this." For answering letters? For the consulting, the documentation guidance. People are asking for it. "People need it," she said. "I'm not going to charge them for something they need. That's not a sustainable position." "It's the position I have right now," she said. "When it becomes unsustainable, I'll revise it." She looked up at him. "Not everything has to be a business." "Everything on a ranch has to be a business," he said, but without the conviction of a man who entirely believes the thing he's saying. "This ranch is a business," she agreed. "My letters are something else." She held his gaze. "I spent a year learning that I could be useful here. I'm not going to immediately put a price on the part of it that doesn't require me to." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair enough." She went back to her letter. He poured himself a second coffee and sat with it and didn't immediately go back to whatever he had come in from the office to get away from, which was itself a form of company she had grown accustomed to and would have missed if it stopped. The winter that year was hard but manageable in the way that things are manageable when you have prepared for them. The thinned herd carried well on the reduced pasture. The cooperative grazing arrangement absorbed the overflow with minimal friction. The burn section sat under snow and did the slow underground work of recovery that fire-adapted land does when you leave it alone and let it. She thought sometimes about what the ranch had been when she arrived, the specific texture of its difficulty, the way the old decisions had accumulated into a weight that nobody was quite naming. She thought about the ledger on the kitchen table and the winter feed projection and the 12 below and the draw in the fire. She thought about all of it, not with nostalgia exactly, but with the particular regard you have for a stretch of time that shaped you in ways you couldn't have planned for. January brought Gerald Voss. He arrived with a nurse and a wheelchair and the diminished but alert quality of a man whose body had failed him considerably faster than his mind had. He was 71 and had been living with a daughter in Billings since the winter before Evelyn arrived, and this was his first return to the ranch in 14 months. Colton had told her he was coming with a brevity that suggested he hadn't fully worked out how he felt about it. She made the house ready. She prepared the ground floor room that had been storage, cleared it, furnished it practically, arranged the bathroom access with Dora's help. She did it without being asked, because it needed doing and she knew how to do it. Gerald Voss arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January, and the first thing he did when the wagon stopped in the yard was look at the ranch with the slow, assessing look of a man who knows a place deeply and is measuring what time has done to it. He looked at the fence lines, at the barn, at the house. He looked at the yard. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was standing on the porch. "You're Evelyn," he said. His voice was rougher than it had probably been, but still carried. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment with pale eyes that were his son's eyes, the same focused quality of attention, the same unsoftened directness. "Thomas Hartwell's daughter," he said. "Yes." "Your father's a good man who made poor decisions," Gerald said. "I've known a few of those." He looked at the yard again, then back at her. "They tell me you saved the herd in the fire." Abe Cutler showed me where the draw was, she said. Roy held the tail with me. It wasn't one person. Gerald looked at her steadily. That's not what Roy says. She didn't answer that. Help me up these steps, he said, and she came down and offered her arm, and he took it without excessive ceremony, and they went into the house together. The first dinner with Gerald at the table was the most uncomfortable meal she had sat through since her early weeks on the ranch, but not for the reasons she had expected. Gerald was not unkind to her. He was not unkind to Colton either, exactly. What he was honest in the specific way of an old man who has decided he no longer has the time or the patience for the careful navigation of difficult things. And that honesty had a quality of pressure to it, the way the atmosphere has pressure you don't notice until it changes. He asked her about the water case. He asked her about the fire damage assessment. He asked her about the cooperative presentation. He asked these things at the dinner table with Colton sitting 2 feet away, and the questions were not aimed at Colton, they were aimed at her, and the fact of their being aimed at her, directly, specifically, without the reflexive deferral to his son that would have been the comfortable default, was itself a statement that she could feel Colton receiving. After dinner, Gerald asked to see the office. Colton wheeled him in. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen until Colton came out 20 minutes later with an expression she couldn't immediately read. What did he say? She asked. Colton was quiet for a moment. He poured water and stood at the counter with it, and didn't drink it. He said the books look better than they've looked in 10 years. He paused. He said he knew they would. He knew? He's the one who agreed to the marriage arrangement. Colton looked at the water glass. I thought it was because of the debt situation with your father. He let me think that. Another pause. He told me tonight that he had your uncle's operation looked into before the arrangement was offered. Looked into your specifically. The books you kept, the decisions you influenced. He stopped. He knew what he was bringing here. She stood very still. He chose you, Colton said. Not with resentment. That was the thing that struck her. With something more complicated than resentment, something that had gratitude in it and difficulty in equal parts. I thought it was circumstance. It wasn't. She thought about her father at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor. She thought about the conversation that had preceded that one, the conversation she hadn't been present for, between Thomas Hartwell and Gerald Voss, a conversation that had been about a debt, but had also, apparently, been about something else. He could have told me, she said. She meant Gerald. He said you wouldn't have come if you'd known. She thought about that, about whether it was true, about whether arriving as someone's deliberate choice would have changed the quality of what she had built here, whether it would have made it feel less like hers. He was probably right, she said. Colton set down the water glass. He turned and looked at her with the direct, unguarded quality that had become more frequent over the year and still caught her slightly off guard each time she encountered it. I was wrong about you from the beginning, he said. Not just about your capability, about the kind of person you were. I had decided before you got off that wagon, and I was wrong, and I let that wrongness cost you things you shouldn't have had to pay. She looked at him. She thought about the stone she had described to herself in the first days, the particular weight of being dismissed, the way it settles in the chest. She thought about what she had said to herself that she used it for. You changed, she said. That's not a small thing. It shouldn't have needed changing. No, she agreed. But people are what they are until something shows them differently. You saw it and you changed it. Some people don't. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and he put his hand against her face, gently, against the cheek where the burn had been, where the skin was still slightly different in texture than the rest. And she leaned into it slightly because it was there, and she had stopped pretending she didn't want it there. This is working, he said. He was giving her phrase back to her, and she heard the full weight of what he was including in it. I know, she said. Gerald stayed 3 weeks. He spent his mornings in the office with whoever would sit with him, Evelyn usually, because she was there and because they had discovered in the first days that they talked easily in the way of people who think about similar things in similar ways. He asked her about the March planning meeting with Ruth Baird, and she told him about it, and he said, Ruth Baird is the most underestimated rancher in 3 counties, with the certainty of a man who had been watching that landscape for 50 years. I got that impression, Evelyn said. What do you think you'll do with it? Gerald asked. The network you're building, the cooperative work, the consulting. She looked at him. I don't know yet. That's the right answer. He looked at the north pasture through the office window. The wrong answer is the one that closes things off before you've seen what they could become. She thought about that for days after he said it. She turned it over the way you turn over a sentence that contains something real in it. By the time Gerald went back to Billings at the end of January, something had clarified in her that she didn't have a specific name for yet. It was directional rather than specific. Not a plan, but a heading. She had come to this ranch with a bag of books and a ledger and a determination that was more defensive than anything else. A wall built against the judgment of people who had already decided who she was. She had spent a year dismantling that judgment piece by piece, not by arguing against it, but by doing something different than what it predicted. And now the judgment was mostly gone, and the wall she had built against it was still standing, and she was beginning to understand that it hadn't been a wall at all. It had been a foundation. The letters were still coming. February brought a request from an agricultural extension office 2 counties east. They had heard about the water documentation guide through Clara Webb and wanted to know if she would be willing to present to a group of young ranchers they were working with. She wrote back yes. March brought the planning meeting with Ruth Baird, which was a revelation in several ways. The room was larger than she had expected. 40-some people, county officials and ranching operators, and water management representatives. And the conversation was substantive in the way that conversations are substantive when the people in them have real stakes in the outcomes. She presented the water documentation process and the pasture recovery methodology together, framed as a connected system rather than separate tools. And the response was not the polite attention of people being professional, but the engaged attention of people recognizing something useful. A county water board official named Harris stopped her afterward and said, the documentation framework she had built for the Fenner case was the most practical model he had seen for individual operation water rights enforcement, and he wanted to know if she would work with his office to adapt it as a template for wider distribution. She said she would. She drove home in the March dark with Ruth Baird's dry commentary about county politics filling the wagon ride, and she thought about foundations and what you build on them. And by the time the Voss Ranch gate came into view, she had the beginning of something that felt, for the first time, like her own shape rather than anyone else's. Colton was awake when she got in. She could see the office lamp from the yard. She went inside and put her head around the office door. "Good meeting," she said. He looked up, took in whatever her face was doing. "Yeah? Harris from the water board wants to work with me on a county-wide template, modeled on the Fenner documentation." Colton set down his pen. "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "That's going to take time." "Yes. Ranch time." "I can manage both," she said. "Unless you think I can't." He looked at her with that look, the one she had first seen through a crack in the wall he'd built, and could now read clearly, unobstructed. "I've never thought that," he said. "Not for a long time." She came into the office and sat down and looked at what he was working on, and found a question in it, and they worked together until the lamp needed refilling, which was late, and neither of them thought to stop before it was. Outside, the Montana winter was in its last serious weeks, doing what it does, pressing down on everything, testing what holds. Inside the Voss Ranch house, in the warm light of a room that had once felt like foreign territory and now felt like something else entirely, 2 people worked side by side on the business of keeping a piece of difficult land alive. The land outside was still burned on its northern sections, still bare and black-edged where the fire had come through in September. But underneath it, in the soil that fire-adapted grass has been improving for longer than any of them had been alive, the recovery was already happening, invisible and steady and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. The County Water Board template took 8 months to build. Harris was thorough in the way that government officials are thorough when they believe in what they are doing. Methodical, process-oriented, attentive to the kind of detail that makes a document usable by people who weren't involved in creating it. Evelyn worked with him through the spring and into the summer, driving to the county seat twice a month, corresponding by letter in between, building a framework that translated what she had done on the Voss Ranch into something replicable across different operation sizes, different water right histories, different levels of legal sophistication among the operators who would use it. It was painstaking work. It was also, she discovered, the kind of work she was built for. The patient assembly of something complex from its components, the translation of specific experience into general principle, The constant testing of an idea against the question of whether a person who hadn't been there could actually follow it. The ranch ran in parallel with all of this. That was the part people tended to underestimate when they heard about the waterboard work. They imagined it had displaced something, that she had stepped back from the operational management to pursue the consulting and the policy work. She hadn't. She was at the ranch every morning before 6. She was still doing the rotation schedules, still updating the ledgers, still walking the recovering burn sections with a notebook, still sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, answering letters from operations in 4 counties who had gotten her name through the cooperative network or through Clara Webb or through Ruth Baird, who had become, over the course of a year, something Evelyn carefully avoided calling a mentor because Ruth would have found the word irritating, but who functioned as one in every practical respect. The burn sections came back faster than she had projected, which was one of the more gratifying surprises of her second full year on the ranch. By midsummer, the northwest pasture was showing green in a density that indicated the ash had done exactly what fire ash does in country that has been burning and recovering for centuries. It had fed the soil in ways that the previous year's overgrazing had depleted, and the grass that came up was stronger than the grass that had been there before the fire. Abe Cutler walked it with her in July and said, with the sparse economy that was his characteristic register, better than it was. Better than it was before the drought even, she said. He considered this. Fire's useful if you survive it. She thought about that sentence for longer than he probably intended her to. The full rotation was back on the northwest sections by late September, 1 year ahead of her conservative estimate, 2 months ahead of her optimistic one. The herd that had been thinned for the cooperative grazing arrangement came back to full capacity in October, and the numbers in the fall ledger were the strongest she had seen since she started keeping the Voss books. Not extraordinary numbers. Ranching in this part of Montana did not produce extraordinary numbers in any single year because the land and the weather and the market didn't cooperate with that kind of linearity, but solid, genuinely solid, the kind of numbers that represent an operation that has found its correct form. She showed the fall account to Colton on a Tuesday evening in the first week of November, and he went through it carefully, column by column, in the silence that meant he was doing the same cross-referencing in his head that she had done on paper, and when he finished, he put the ledger down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "We're not behind anymore," he said. "No. We haven't not been behind in—" He stopped, calculating. 7 years, she said, based on the historical records. He looked at her. He picked up the ledger again and looked at it again, not because he needed to look at it again, but because sometimes the only response to a real thing is to look at it twice. "What do you need?" he asked. She understood what he was asking. Not what did she need personally. They had worked that out between them over 2 years in the patient, imperfect, genuinely difficult way that 2 people work things out when neither of them is naturally inclined toward the easy version of anything. He was asking about the work, the county work, the expanding network, the thing she was building that had grown past the borders of a description he could fully see yet. A dedicated workspace, she said. Not the office. You need the office. Something separate where I can keep the county documentation, meet with people when they come to the ranch. He nodded. The east room off the barn. It's been storage. We can clear it, weatherproof it. That would work. What else? A budget for correspondence. The letters are getting expensive. Done. He paused. What else? She looked at him. That's all for now. Evelyn. He said her name with the particular weight he had developed for it over 2 years. Not heavy, but present. The weight of a man who means to be taken seriously when he says a name. What else? She thought about how to say it. She had been thinking about how to say it for 3 months, and she still didn't have a clean version. I think what I'm doing is going to get bigger, she said. The water board template. Harris thinks the state agricultural office is going to adopt it. If they do, that means training sessions, probably. Regional presentations. Time away from the ranch. How much time? I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. He was quiet, looking at the ledger without seeing it. She waited, because she had learned that his silences were working silences, not empty ones, and interrupting them was the wrong move. This ranch runs better with you running it than it did before you got here, he said finally. That's not sentiment, it's the account books. He looked up. But this ranch can also run with Pete and Abe and the crew if you need to be somewhere else sometimes. It did before. It was running itself into the ground before. It was. Now it's not. He held her gaze. Go do the state thing. Come back. Both of those things can be true at the same time. She let out a breath that had been held longer than she realized. All right. You were going to do it regardless, he said, not as an accusation, just as an observation. Yes, she admitted. But I wanted it to be a conversation, not a unilateral decision. Something crossed his face, warm, brief. The particular expression of a man who is being shown a version of himself he is still getting used to. That's more than I gave you at the start, he said. We're not at the start, she said. The State Agricultural Office adopted the water documentation template in February of her 3rd year on the ranch. Harris sent her a letter that was 2 pages of formal language and 1 sentence at the end in handwriting rather than typescript that said, "This is your work. Make sure they know that." She read that sentence several times and then folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept things that mattered. The regional training sessions began in March, 4 of them over 6 weeks, held in different county seats across the northern part of the state. She drove to the first one herself, 4 hours in the ranch wagon on roads that were still winter difficult, and arrived at the meeting hall in a town she'd never been to and stood in front of 60 ranchers and agricultural officials and delivered a 3-hour presentation on water rights documentation and pasture recovery management that had been built from 2 years of specific, physical, daily practice on one piece of ground in one hard valley. The questions afterward ran long. She answered all of them, and when she didn't know the answer, she said so. And when the question required a distinction she hadn't made clearly enough in the presentation, she went back and made it. And when a rancher in the back of the room, weathered, skeptical, with the particular face of a man who has attended many presentations and found most of them useless, said, "How do we know this works in heavier clay soil than what you've got in that valley?" She said, "We don't yet, and that's a real question, and here's how I'd suggest testing it." And she walked him through the methodology. He found her afterward, that rancher, and handed her his card without saying much, and 2 months later he wrote her a letter that said the clay soil modifications she had suggested had worked, and that his spring water measurement was the highest it had been in 4 years, and that he had shared the process with 3 of his neighbors. She wrote back. She always wrote back. Ruth Baird drove to the 4th training session, 6 hours from her ranch, which Evelyn didn't discover until afterward, and sat in the back and didn't say anything during the session and found Evelyn at the end and said, "You know what you're doing now." Not as a compliment exactly, more as a diagnosis. "I've known for a while," Evelyn said. "You've known for longer than that. You're just saying it out loud now." Ruth looked at her with those level eyes. There's a land management conference in Helena in September, statewide. Agricultural officials, university extension people, some federal water board representatives. I've been asked to speak. She paused. "I want you there." To present? To present alongside me. Different components, same framework. Another pause. "They're going to ask who you are." "What should I tell them?" Ruth looked at her. "Whatever is true," she said, as if it were the simplest question in the world. Evelyn drove home through the spring landscape, the long Montana light of May, the grass coming up in the meadows, the mountains still snow-capped, but the valleys green and present and real, and she thought about what was true. She was a rancher's wife from a small farming town who had arrived on a wagon in September 2.5 years ago with a bag of books and her uncle's stock horse and a determination she hadn't fully understood the shape of yet. She was the person who had read the ledger, documented the water flow, moved the cattle in the hard cold, laid flat in the draw while the fire went over. She was the person who had built a foundation she hadn't known she was building until she found herself standing on it. That was what was true. She got home after dark. Colton was in the yard when she pulled in, which she hadn't expected, and he took the horse without being asked, and she stood in the yard and looked at the ranch house on its slight rise with the lamplight in the windows and the sound of the hands in the bunkhouse and the particular smell of the place that she had absorbed so completely over 2 years that it had become the smell of being home without her having specifically decided that would happen. "Good session?" he asked, coming back from the barn. Ruth Baird drove 6 hours to sit in the back. He stopped. 6 hours. "I found out after. She didn't say anything while she was there." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A real laugh, the full version, which she had learned was not a thing he did lightly or often, and which still caught her slightly sideways when it happened because it changed his face completely. She drove 6 hours, he said again, still with the laugh in his voice. She wants me at a statewide conference in Helena in September. Of course she does. She looked at him in the lamplight. He looked back. The yard was quiet, and the night was cool, and 2.5 years of a difficult and real life together lay between them and behind them, and, she understood, ahead of them. Colton, she said. I know, he said. She wasn't sure what exactly he knew, and she didn't ask because she had learned that with some people, the knowledge arrives before the words do, and pressing for the words can break something that the knowledge was holding together. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote 4 letters, to Harris, to Clara Webb, to the rancher with the clay soil, to the extension office that had hosted the first training session. And when she was done, she sat for a while in the quiet kitchen with her pen in her hand and thought about the woman who had sat at a different kitchen table 2.5 years ago and been told the shape her life had taken. That woman had been afraid, though she hadn't called it that. She had called it vigilance, which was the more useful version of the same thing. She had arrived here watchful and braced and carrying a lifetime of being dismissed like a pack she couldn't quite set down. She had set it down somewhere over the last 2 years, without marking the moment. She didn't know exactly when. Sometime between the ledger and the fire, between the water measurements and the county records office, between Pete's first direct question and Ruth Baird's 6-hour drive, between one version of a man who had made his judgments and another version of the same man laughing in a lamplit yard at something true. The Helena conference in September was the largest room she had spoken in. 400 people, maybe more, ranching operators, state and federal officials, university researchers, extension agents, policy people whose relationship to land was theoretical rather than physical, and who therefore asked the most interesting questions because they weren't constrained by what they already knew from experience. Ruth Baird presented first, covering the broader landscape of northern Montana ranching policy, which she did with the efficient authority of a woman who has been thinking about these things for 30 years and has lost patience with equivocation. Then Evelyn presented the implementation framework, the documentation methodology, the water rights process, the pasture recovery model, with 2 years of statewide application data behind it now. Not just her own experience on one ranch, but the aggregated results from 60-some operations that had used the template in some form. The data was persuasive in the way that real data is persuasive, not because it said something surprising, but because it said something true in a form that was hard to argue with. Operations that had implemented the water documentation process had resolved rights disputes at 3 times the rate of operations that hadn't, and had resolved them faster and with lower legal costs. Pastures managed under the rotational recovery framework she had derived from the Voss burn sections were showing 30-year high productivity measurements in the second recovery year. These were not small numbers. These were numbers that meant something to people whose livelihoods depended on the land those numbers described. She talked for 2 hours. She answered questions for 40 minutes after that. A federal water board official from Washington, a young woman, probably younger than Evelyn had been when she arrived at the Voss Ranch, with the specific kind of focus that means a person is paying attention to something they intend to use, asked about the scalability of the documentation framework to federal water right disputes, which were more complex than state-level ones, and Evelyn talked through the differences and the places where the framework would need adaptation, and the woman wrote everything down. Afterward, Ruth found her in the hallway outside the main room and said, without preamble, "The University Extension Office wants to publish the framework as a formal guide, with your name on it." Evelyn looked at her. "A published guide. Agricultural management, distribution through the state extension network. Possibly national, if the Federal Water Board takes an interest, which I think they will based on that question at the end." Ruth paused. "Your name on it, Evelyn. Not the county board's name, not the cooperative's name. Yours." She thought about her name on something, about what it would mean for the woman who had driven 4 hours to the first training session in a ranch wagon to have her name on a document distributed through a national agricultural network. She thought about what the name meant, not the name she had come with, Hartwell, her father's name, the name of a man who had made poor decisions, but the name she had been building for 2 years. Voss. Evelyn Voss. The name of a woman who had made a foundation from a dismissal and spent 2 years figuring out what to build on it. Yes, she said. All right. Ruth nodded once, the way she nodded when a thing was decided. I'll contact the extension office tomorrow. She looked at Evelyn with those direct eyes. You were ready for this 3 years ago, you know, before the ranch, before any of this. I wasn't, Evelyn said. I needed the ranch. Why? She thought about it. Because the ranch was real, she said. Books and ledgers and water measurements and 40 minutes on the ground in a fire. All of it real. All of it with actual consequences if you got it wrong. I needed that. I needed to know I could do it when the cost of doing it wrong was something that mattered. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That's the thing most people don't understand about practical knowledge, she said. It has to be earned in conditions that cost something. Otherwise, it's just information. Evelyn nodded. She had understood that for a long time, in her bones, if not in words. Her uncle had taught her that without ever saying it directly, the same way Abe Cutler had taught her the land without making it a lesson. Some knowledge only comes through doing the thing, in the cold, when it matters. She drove home the next day. The September light on the drive back was different from the May light of the conference drive. Lower, more golden, with the particular quality of autumn in high country that makes everything look slightly more itself than it does in other seasons. She drove through country she had been driving through for 2.5 years, and she saw it with the double vision she had developed. The surface of it, the grass and rock and sky, and underneath that the water table and the soil composition and the grazing history and the recovery stages of different sections, all of it mapped in her head now, as specifically as a person maps the rooms of their own house. She got home in the late afternoon. The yard was busy with the end-of-day work, horses being brought in, the evening feed, the specific productive noise of a working ranch at the close of a working day. Pete was at the barn door talking to Abe, and when she pulled the wagon in, Abe looked up and gave her the nod that was his version of a welcome home. She gave it back. Colton came out of the house. He had been watching for the wagon, she suspected, though he would not have said so. He came down the porch steps and took the horse's bridle and looked at her face. Good, he said. Very good, she said. Ruth's arranging for the framework to be published, a formal agricultural guide. He was still for a moment. Published. State Extension Network, possibly national. He looked at her with that stripped-back expression, the one that had no management in it, that she had first seen in the Southwest Draw when he came over the rim and found her still alive. He used it less rarely now, used it more often with her than with anyone else, which she took for what it was. Come inside, he said. Dora made something. She came inside. Dora had indeed made something. A full meal, better than a regular evening warranted, the kind of meal that gets made when someone in the house understands that something worth marking has happened. Dora set it out without saying anything about why, and Evelyn ate with Colton at the kitchen table, and they talked about the conference and about the questions and about the Federal Water Board woman and about Ruth's 6-hour drive. And somewhere in the middle of the meal, Colton said, "My father would like to hear about this." "I'll write to him," she said. "He'd rather you called." He paused. "He talks about you. When I speak with him, he says—" He stopped, choosing the words. "He says he knew what he was doing." "He did," she said. "He knew better than either of us." "He was right about you," Colton said. "I wasn't, at the start. We've covered that." "I know. I'm still—" He stopped again. She waited. "I'm still working out how to be sorry for something that also turned out the way it should. Those two things don't sit easily together." She looked at him across the table. This was the thing about Colton. The thing she had spent 2 years learning, the thing she thought she would spend many more years learning because it was genuinely complex. He was not a man who did easy things. He was not warm in the ways that warmth usually advertised itself. He didn't make things smooth. What he did was mean it, mean the difficult sentences, mean the revised judgments, mean the changed behavior. He had looked at himself in the mirror of what she had done on his land, and he had not looked away from what he saw there, and that was a harder thing than most people managed. "You don't have to sit them easily together," she said. "They can both be true at the same time. You were wrong at the start and it turned out right in the end. Both of those things happened." "Because of you," he said. "Because of both of us," she said. "Because you changed. That was your part. I can't do someone else's part for them." He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the faded rope burn marks, which she had mostly stopped noticing and which he had not stopped noticing, she knew, because she had caught him looking at them sometimes with the expression of a man who keeps an accounting of things he wishes he could undo. "All right," he said, "both of us." She turned her hand and held his back, and they sat at the kitchen table in the house that had been foreign territory once, and was not anymore, and outside the window. The September dark was settling over the Voss Ranch with the particular completeness of nights at elevation, star-heavy and cold and very large. Gerald Voss died in November, in Billings, with his daughter beside him and a clear day through the window. Colton got the news by telegraph and went quiet in the specific way of a man absorbing something that was expected and is still a blow. Evelyn didn't try to fill the quiet. She sat with him in the evenings, and she drove to Billings with him for the burial, and she stood beside him at the grave in the cold November air and held his arm and didn't say things that weren't true, which was the only form of comfort she knew how to offer, that she trusted. On the drive back, Colton said, "He told me something the last time I was there last month." "What did he say?" "He said the ranch was in better hands than it had ever been." He looked at the road ahead. "He said both sets of hands." She didn't answer because there wasn't anything to add to it. "He was proud of you," Colton said. More than he said directly. That was his way. "I know," she said. "I understood him." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "He told me once, I was maybe 22, stubborn about something I don't even remember now. He told me that the mistake people make is thinking strength means you don't need anyone. He said real strength is knowing who to trust and trusting them completely." He paused. "I didn't listen. Not for a long time." "You listened eventually," she said. "Too late for some things." "Not for the things that mattered," she said. She meant it. She had never said things to Colton she didn't mean. He drove. The road was long and the country was wide and November bare around them, and somewhere in the middle of the drive his hand found hers on the wagon seat, and she let it stay, and they came home to the Voss Ranch in the dark, to the yard and the barn and the horses and the lit windows of the house, and it was theirs in the way that things are yours when you have earned them through years of difficult, real, specific effort. The Agricultural Management Guide was published the following spring. 62 pages, with diagrams Evelyn had drawn herself and legal annotations from Clara Webb, and a foreword by Ruth Baird that was 3 paragraphs long and characteristically unornamental, and said, in its final line, that the author had demonstrated that practical wisdom and formal knowledge were not different things when both were earned in conditions that cost something. Evelyn Hartwell Voss. That was the name on the cover. She had put both names because both names were hers, the one she had come with and the one she had built into, and she was not interested in erasing either history for the sake of a cleaner story. The guide went into distribution through the Montana State Extension Network in April. By July, it had been requested by extension offices in Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado. By the following January, the Federal Water Board had formally adopted the documentation framework for use in priority dispute guidance at the national level, and the young woman who had asked about scalability at the Helena Conference sent Evelyn a letter that said the framework had been used successfully in 3 federal water disputes in its first 6 months of application, and that she had cited Evelyn's work in a report to Congress. A report to Congress. Evelyn read that sentence in the letter, and then read it again, and then set the letter down and went to find Colton, who was in the barn doing what Colton did in the barn, which was the physical and specific work of running a cattle operation, which he was still doing every day, which was the foundation that held everything else up. She found him, and she told him, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at her for a long moment with the full attention he gave to things that were real. "A report to Congress," he said. That's what she said. He looked at her. He was holding a bridle in both hands, and he was standing in the barn on a January morning in the 6th year of their marriage. And he was looking at her the way he had been looking at her for years now, without the layers and without the distance, with the clear-eyed directness of a man who had looked at something difficult and learned to see it accurately. "You came off that wagon," he said, "with 1 bag. And my uncle's horse," she said. "And your uncle's horse." He set the bridle down. "I said, I know what you said," she said. "I heard it. I'm going to be sorry for that for the rest of my life." "Don't be," she said, Be glad it changed. She stepped into the barn, into the warm smell of horses and hay, and the particular animal presence of a working stable. The sorry isn't useful, Colton. The change is. He looked at her for another long moment, and then he nodded, once, and picked the bridle back up because there was work to do, and she went back to the house because she had letters to write, and a second edition of the Guide to Plan, and a rotation schedule due to Pete by Thursday. The burned sections in the Northwest were fully recovered by that spring, 5 years after the fire, ahead of even her revised projection. Abe Cutler walked them with her in April the way he had walked them every spring since the recovery began, and he looked at the grass, which was dense and strong and showing the particular vitality of land that had been through something and come out the other side of it, and he said, "Better than before the drought." "You said that 4 years ago," she said, "when it was just starting." "I was right then too," he said. She laughed, which she did more easily now than she had when she arrived. Not because her life was easier, because it wasn't. Ranching is not easy and never will be. But because she had learned the specific skill of being present in what was good without waiting for permission to find it good. The cooperative had grown. What had been a loose association of county operations when she first presented to it was now a formal organization with 42 member operations across 3 counties, a shared equipment program, a collective feed purchasing arrangement that had reduced input costs for every member by an average of 11%, and an annual conference that drew speakers from the university extension system and twice now from federal agricultural agencies. Evelyn chaired the Land Management Committee. Ruth Baird chaired the Water Rights Committee. Pete Callahan, who had evolved over 5 years from a man who had described her work with careful professional neutrality into something approaching a genuine ally, which was more than she had expected and was therefore among the things she valued most, represented the Voss Ranch on the Operations Committee. Dale Morrow had left the Voss Ranch 2 years after the fire to take work in Wyoming, which Evelyn considered the most satisfactory possible outcome for everyone involved. Roy, who had been 17 and scared in the draw and had gotten back on his horse, was now 23 and one of the 3 most reliable hands on the property, and Pete had started talking about him as a potential foreman candidate for the future, which was the kind of succession planning that a healthy operation did and a struggling one didn't have the room to do. She got a letter from her mother in the 5th year. Her mother wrote rarely and briefly, in the spare prose of a woman who had never been encouraged to take up much space with words, and the letter was characteristically brief. It said that her father had sold the North Field, which had been the field that started everything, and that they were doing better, and that she had seen a notice about the agricultural guide in the county newspaper and had shown it to Thomas, and that Thomas had kept the clipping. She read the letter twice and thought about her father keeping the clipping, putting it somewhere, taking it out sometimes. She thought about what it cost him to have needed the arrangement that had sent her north on a wagon, and she thought about what it had produced, and she decided that the accounting between what it cost and what it produced was too complex to resolve cleanly, and that she didn't need it resolved cleanly. She wrote back. She told her mother that the ranch was doing well, and that she was well, and that she would come south in the summer, which she did, with Colton, who met her parents for the first time with the specific careful courtesy of a man who knows he is meeting people he owes something to and is determined to pay it in the only currency available, which is conduct. Thomas Hartwell shook Colton's hand in the yard of the Harding farm and said very little, which was his way, and Colton said very little back, which was also his way. And Evelyn stood to one side and watched 2 men who had both underestimated her in their different fashions and for their different reasons, standing in the same patch of dirt being careful with each other, and she felt something that she would have struggled to name precisely. Not vindication, because vindication required a kind of scorekeeping she had never been very good at, and not forgiveness, because she had never been particularly angry in the first place. Something quieter than either of those things. Something that had more to do with the understanding that people are mostly trying to do the right thing with the tools they have, and the tools they have are the product of everything that made them, and the everything that made them is long and complicated and only partially visible. Her mother made dinner, and they ate it at the kitchen table where Thomas Hartwell had once sat with his hat in his hands, and the table was the same table and the kitchen was the same kitchen. But Evelyn was not the same woman who had sat in this room being told the shape her life had taken. She was the woman who had taken that shape and worked with it and made it into something she could live in and then outgrown the inside of and expanded until the shape was her own. She thought about that on the drive back north through the long summer light, with Colton beside her on the wagon seat and the mountains visible on the western horizon in that particular blue that mountains get in late afternoon. She thought about what it actually meant to earn a life, not to have it handed to you, not to suffer for it in the way that people romanticize suffering, but to do the specific, daily, unglamorous work of building something real. The water measurements, the letters, the walk through the draw with cattle behind her and fire above her, and 40 minutes on the ground where she had nothing but her own knowledge of the land and her own capacity to stay still. Nobody tells you, when you are young and being told the shape your life has taken, that the shape is not fixed. They tell you the opposite, usually, that the shape is what it is, that the circumstances are the circumstances, that the question of who you are has already been substantially answered by other people's decisions. They tell you this not with cruelty, mostly, but with the honest belief of people who have found the shape of their own lives fixed and have concluded that this is how life works. What Evelyn had learned in 5 years on a piece of difficult land in northern Montana was that the shape was not fixed. It was more like the land itself, responsive, dynamic, capable of recovery that you couldn't see while it was happening, capable of becoming more itself after the fire than it had been before. The burn sections had come back better than before the drought. She had come back better from everything that had tried to reduce her. Not perfect. She wanted to be precise about that, because the story that gets told about women like her tends toward a particular kind of cleanness, a satisfying arc from dismissal to triumph. And the real thing was never that clean. She was still impatient sometimes. She was still not good at accepting help on her own terms rather than other people's. She still occasionally sat with the ledger at midnight when she should have been sleeping because the numbers were interesting to her, and rest was less interesting. And Colton had given up asking her to come to bed at a reasonable hour and had taken to leaving a lamp on instead, which was the kind of accommodation that is more intimate than most declarations. She was still the woman her mother had sent off with 3 jars of preserves and a warning not to make them regret taking her. She would always be that woman. But she was also the woman whose name was on a guide in 62 extension offices, whose framework was cited in federal water dispute cases, who had moved a herd in 12 below dark and laid flat in a burning draw and walked every section of a recovering ranch with her notebook and her pen. Both of those women were the same woman. The second one had grown inside the first one all along, waiting for conditions. The Voss Ranch in the fall of its 6th year under her management was not the place she had pulled into on a September afternoon with her travel bag clutched against her chest and a man's dismissal settling over her like weather. It was a working operation that had found its correct form. Not its perfect form, because perfect forms don't exist in ranching or anywhere else, but its right one. The books were solid. The land was recovering ahead of schedule. The herd was healthy. The water ran clear in the creek that Carl Fenner had once tried to steal by increments, and the creek's flow had been measured and documented and legally secured in a way that would hold up to any challenge that came. Colton came in from the barn on a Tuesday evening in the first week of October, the 5th fall after the fire, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table where she was working on the 2nd edition of the guide, and he looked at what she was working on, and then he looked at her with that clear, direct, unmanaged look that she had grown to need the way you grow to need a particular quality of light. "What do you need tomorrow?" he asked. It was how they had started talking, somewhere in the 2nd year, after the operational restructuring, after the foundation was laid. Not what do you want or what are you planning, but what do you need, practical and present and specific. The language of 2 people whose currency was the actual work of an actual life. "I need Abe to walk the northeast corner with me," she said. "The grass coverage is thinner than I'd like going into winter. I want to know what he thinks. I'll tell him in the morning. And the county water board is sending someone Thursday, a new staff person who needs to understand the documentation protocol. I'll stay out of the office." "You don't need to—" "I'll stay out of the office," he said again, and the way he said it was simply practical, not accommodating, not generous. Just the adjustment of a man who has understood what the work requires and makes the adjustments without editorializing about them. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the lamplight of the house that was theirs, on the land that was theirs, in the life that had been shaped by circumstances and remade by the daily, unglamorous, necessary work of 2 imperfect people choosing not to stay who they were. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For staying out of the office," she said, and it wasn't about the office, And they both knew it wasn't about the office, and neither of them needed to say what it was actually about. Because some things you carry for long enough that they become part of how you breathe, part of how you sit in a lit room with someone on a cold October evening while the ranch settles into the dark outside and the work waits, the way it always waits, patient and specific and real. The stone she had carried since the day she stepped off that wagon. The particular weight of being dismissed before you opened your mouth, of being reduced to someone else's expectation before you had the chance to be yourself. She had set it down so long ago she couldn't mark the day. But she knew what she had built with it. She had built this.